Probable Paws by Corinne Winters, Book 4 of the Kitten Witch series. For the ad-free version or to get the rest of the series, pick up the audiobook at Corinne Winters' Cozy Mystery Bookstore by going to cutecozymystery.com. Be sure to use discount code CUTE40 to take 40% off. Chapter 1. The Broken Broom had just closed up for the night, the last patrons heading home and the waitstaff, counting their tips, chattering their friendly goodnights as they trotted in the streetlights out to their cars. All around, the little town of Cauchemar, Louisiana, seemed to be settling into a thick, heavy summer night's sleep. The pub windows went dark, their warm orange glow blinking out until only one faint light, the shine of a single lamp, remained. Inside the pub, the proprietress, Ember McNair, sat in the circle of that lamplight, going over the evening's numbers. Not bad for a weeknight. The Broken Broom had been so busy, Ember had barely had time to get off her feet all night. Her ears still echoed with the sounds of all the night's chatter and cheer. The quiet and the comfort of her seat were a wonderful relief after all that excitement. And yet she couldn't seem to settle down. There was a sense in the air. A dancing, prickling feeling crawling up and down Ember's skin, causing her hairs to stand on end. It was a magical feeling, one that a trained witch like Ember had learned not to ignore. During the busy rush of evenings at the pub, she must have mistaken the rising sensation for sheer industry. But now, left alone in the darkness and quiet, she recognized it for what it was. There was something wrong. "Hello?" she called, looking around, alert to her surroundings. She had the sudden, uneasy feeling she wasn't alone. No sooner did she call out than she thought she heard something shift. The lightest sound, off in the distance. As quietly as she could manage, Ember rose, careful not to let her chair scrape loudly against the ground. "Hello?" she called again, more softly this time. That was when her fluffy kitten familiar, Kaylee, chose to make her appearance. She trotted quickly into the dining area and hopped with great delicacy and acrobatic flair up onto the table. "Were you really scared?" Kaylee asked, curious. "I'm sorry, I was just hunting mice." Ember laughed nervously and let out a little sigh. "Please don't tell me we have mice," she groaned. "No, it turned out to be a shadow," Kaylee said, clearly disappointed. "Why? What's the matter?" "Nothing," Ember said. "I guess it's nothing. Just a feeling." Kaylee was watching her witch carefully. As Ember's familiar, Kaylee was often even more tapped into Ember's emotions than Ember herself was. As soon as Kaylee gave her that look, Ember realized that Kaylee was right to be worried. That strange, prickling all-over feeling hadn't gone away. "The painting," Ember said, distracted. Her instincts were telling her. Something about a painting? She turned and looked at the nearby wall. Over one of the booths, there was an old painting hanging. She'd never paid it much mind. It was an old, stiff-looking portrait of one of her ancestors, and it had been hanging in the Broken Broom since before Ember took over running the place. Now she could see it was hanging crookedly. She crossed to it and leaned over the booth to straighten it. No sooner did she do so than the face in the painting seemed to bulge outward, gaining dimension, the nose growing toward her, the eyes and chin emerging from the flat, oil-painted panel. Ember shrieked and startled backward, nearly toppling over. Except that, once she had caught herself against the table, she saw that the face hadn't moved at all. Rather, a ghost had phased through the wall, passing through the painting as it did so. The ghost was none other than Talako, another deceased ancestor of Ember's, and a good friend. He was looking down at Ember, wearing a concerned expression. "Are you all right?" Talako asked. Kaylee was unhelpfully snickering. "I'm fine," Ember said, catching her breath and dusting herself off, attempting to retain her dignity. "Talako, it's good to see you. What brings you here?" "Some strange news from the art museum," Talako said. Ember knew that the art museum was one of Talako's favorite places to haunt. He was a huge art fan, and surprisingly progressive in his tastes for someone who had been dead for over centuries. "What's the news?" Kaylee asked. One of the paintings has been stolen, Talako said. I was there when it happened, but I was in a different section. I heard a noise, but by the time I figured out where the noise came from, it was all over. What was over? Ember asked. What happened? Evidently, someone hit the guard on the back of the head. Talako shook his head sadly. Brent Underwood, the guard, I mean. I'm not sure who did the hitting. Brent looked incredibly injured when I came across him. I was sadly unable to do anything to help him, of course, but I did manage to dial 911 from the museum phone. I didn't say anything to the operator, but she sent a police car by, and the officer found Brent and called an ambulance. That is exciting, Kaylee said. Is Brent going to be all right? I don't know, Talako admitted. The injury looked most severe. And which painting was it? Ember asked. There was that unsettled, buzzing sensation again, snaking just underneath her skin. You said a painting was stolen. Which one? That's the really interesting part, Talako said. Whoever the thief was must have moved very quickly because by the time I found Brent unconscious, the place where it had hung was gone. It was the painting called Black Seas and Dark Skies. The cursed one? Kaylee asked. Cursed? Ember echoed. A cursed painting? Kaylee nodded sagely. It was supposedly cursed by the painter. She was accused of witchcraft, but she managed to curse it before she was burned at the stake. According to the curse, anyone who has the painting in his home is doomed to die, Talako added. They all looked at one another a moment. Ember wasn't certain what to say. Well, Kaylee added eventually, if the curse is real, I suppose we'll find out the identity of the thief soon enough, won't we? Chapter 2. Just as Ember had finished with the closing up work and was about to switch off the last lamp and head to her apartment above the pub, she heard a faint knock on the door. In the doorway stood Cedric Jameson, tall, built, and handsome. Wolf shifter, local sheriff, and Ember's boyfriend. Cedric smiled faintly when Ember opened the door and let him in. Tired? She asked. Weird night, Cedric said. Just got off a very strange call. I thought there was the faintest chance you might still be up. Maybe even already knew about it. Why would I know about anything? Ember asked with a faux innocent smile. Because whoever called 911 disappeared into thin air for some reason, Cedric replied dryly. And because I happen to know that Talako loved spending his time at the museum late at nights. Ember grinned. Yeah, all right. Talako told me what happened to Brent Underwood, and that Black Seas and Dark Skies had been stolen. Any leads? Cedric strode into the dining area and sat down. Kaylee immediately started to rub up against his ankles, and he leaned down to scratch her head. Well, I got to talk to Underwood a little, Cedric said. He's hospitalized now, but he was conscious enough to speak after a while. He says he doesn't know who hit him. Whoever it was hit him from the back. That's what Talako said. Ember sat across from Cedric. How long was Underwood out for? Just a few minutes, according to him, Cedric answered. The painting was stolen during that time. Do you believe Underwood? Cedric sighed and shrugged. I don't know. Lots of times you hear about these art heists, and the guard is in on it. But he got a pretty nasty knock. I'm still not sure he's going to be okay. It would take a real commitment to an inside job to take a blow like that. Would I be able to talk to him sometime? Ember asked. Sure, if he's well enough for it. Cedric blinked at her, then cocked an eyebrow. Would you want to go now? If that's okay, Ember said, already standing. Suddenly, her exhaustion from the day's work was entirely forgotten. Mysteries had a vivifying effect on her. Yeah, that's fine. Cedric stood gingerly, careful not to tread on Kaylee as he did so. I'll drive you. I should go, too, Kaylee offered, eager. I'll be able to tell if he's lying about anything. Kaylee did have that uniquely useful power, which had come in clutch on more than one occasion. Cedric, however, shook his head. I don't know it's such a good idea to bring a cat into a hospital. Hygienic issues, you know? He cast a look around the pub, clearly indicating that he also wasn't sure it was such a good idea to have a cat hanging around a place that served food. Kaylee turned her back on Cedric and Ember and twitched her tail and sniffed imperiously. "Fine," she said. "If you two wanted to go alone, you could have just said so." Brent Underwood was sitting up in bed when Cedric and Ember made it to his room. He looked seriously worse for wear, with a complex web of bandages wrapped around his forehead and covering most of his hair. But he was conscious. Still, Ember felt guilty making him walk through the story again, just for her sake. In a slightly halting, thick-tongued tone, Brent explained the same version of events that she had gotten from Talako and Cedric. It was an ordinary night, just like any other. And then, suddenly, he'd been hit in the back of the head, hard. He was unconscious before he hit the ground. By the time he woke up, the phone was already off the hook, and the emergency operator was on the line. He realized the painting was gone just seconds before the cops arrived. "No, and you didn't notice anything before you were attacked?" Ember pressed. "You have no clues as to who could have hit you?" "I didn't see them," Brent said. "Whoever it was came up from behind. I didn't even get a glimpse." Now Ember wished she had found a way to sneak Kaylee in after all. She could really have used Kaylee's lie detection skills right about now. But for her part, Ember couldn't help but believe Brent. He was adamant, and he seemed righteously peeved at whoever had hit him. "At least whoever it is has to deal with that curse now," Brent slurred faintly. "They'll get what's coming to them." Ember couldn't tell from his lethargic tone whether he was joking or not. "Well?" Cedric asked as he drove her back home. "Are you convinced?" "That the painting is cursed?" Ember asked. "No, not at all. After all, the painting's been hanging in that museum for years and no one has died." "I think the curse did say something about being in someone's house," Cedric pointed out. Ember scoffed. "Seems like an awfully specific stipulation for an angry witch's curse to split hairs over." Cedric chuckled. "And do you believe Underwood?" Ember shrugged. "I do. Maybe I shouldn't, but I do. I don't think he knows who hit him." Cedric was quiet for a while, and they both mulled the whole case over for the remainder of the drive back to the broken pub. Only when Cedric pulled to a stop in front of the pub did he speak again, his voice softer and more raw this time. "And have you given it any more thought?" This time Ember knew he wasn't asking about the case. He was asking about the marriage proposal he'd given her, which she hadn't been able to answer. Over a week had passed now, and Ember still hadn't said either yes or no. "I'm sorry," she said. He breathed in sharply, clearly hearing this as the beginning of a no. Ember rushed in rapidly. "No, it's not that, not at all. I still haven't decided. I don't want you to jump into another engagement so quickly, not after your last long-term one." "Don't you think that's my decision to make?" Ember smiled at Cedric patiently. "It's our decision," she said, "which includes me. I care about you and I don't want to rush you into anything. Please, Cedric, just let me think it over." He huffed but nodded. She leaned across the console and gave him a sweet, gentle kiss. "It's not a no," she said firmly. "It's just not a yes. Yet." Chapter 3. Soon, Cedric wouldn't have much time to worry about Ember's evasive answer to his proposal. 2 days after their visit with Brent Underwood, the painting Black Seas and Dark Skies was recovered in the living room of Dr. Matthew Tanner. Tanner was dead. Dr. Tanner's home was quickly overrun with a swarm of officers. Cedric arrived on the scene, carefully avoiding the throng of journalists trying to get the inside scoop. The sheriff greeted the officer standing guard, ducked under the line of police tape, and made his way inside the house. "Hey, Sheriff Jameson," one of the responding officers beckoned from the room immediately to the left of the front door. "Hey," Cedric responded. "What have we got?" "A dead man," the officer joked. "But I think you might be more interested in that." The officer pointed to the corner of the room where Black Seas and Dark Skies leaned against the wall. Cedric walked over to the corner and crouched down to get a better look at the supposedly cursed painting. The work itself was nothing incredible, but Cedric sensed a strange aura about it nonetheless. He told himself this was just because of the rumors, nothing more. All right. Cedric stood up. Let's get this taken care of quickly. I'm sure the museum is eager to get this back. The crew of investigating officers delicately packed up the painting and other pieces of evidence for further inspection. Cedric, meanwhile, decided he'd text Ember and give her the newest details about the case. Back at Ember's apartment above the pub, she and Sage were chatting over piping hot cups of coffee. Ember's phone buzzed frantically on the coffee table, and she quickly leaned forward to see what was up. She had a text from Cedric. Ooh! Sage melodramatically cooed. Is that your boo? Ember rolled her eyes at Sage and unlocked her phone to read the text. It read, Painting found at home of Dr. Matthew Tanner. He's dead. Oh my, Ember said out loud when she read the text. What is it? Sage asked, more serious now. Matthew Tanner is dead, and they found black seas and dark skies in his house, Ember said. She quickly shot off a talk more later text to Cedric before returning her phone to the table. Ember joked, So, do you think the painting did it? She turned to Sage, expecting her to laugh at the absurdity of it. Instead, Sage's face was painted with unease. What? Asked Ember. You don't really think it's cursed, do you? Actually, I do, Sage responded. I can think of at least 7 people who owned that painting, and they all died within weeks of bringing it into their homes. Ember pondered. Do you think Tanner knew that when he stole it? What if he didn't steal it? What if someone put it there to kill him? Sage questioned. What makes you ask that? Ember raised an eyebrow at Sage. Has anyone ever used black seas for murder before? No, Sage said softly, but there is a tie between Dr. Tanner and Brent Underwood. The museum guard? Ember asked. Yeah, Sage sipped her coffee. Brent's wife had an affair with Tanner several years ago. She eventually divorced him to be with the doctor. Rumor has it, Brent has never given up hope that he'd have his wife back someday. So you think Underwood stole the painting and snuck it into Matthew Tanner's house in the hopes that the curse was real? I'm not sure what I think, Sage answered, but if you'd like, I can check in with Kokmar's ever-running rumor mill. All right, then maybe I need to talk to this wife. Any idea where she is? Ember turned to Sage. No clue, she said. She and Underwood divorced, but I've heard she still talks to James Connor, the museum curator, every once in a while. With this information in hand, Ember decided to take a trip to the museum herself. She quickly made her way to the fine arts section of the museum, where she found the empty wall space that was supposed to house black seas and dark skies. Ember looked carefully around the area and soon saw a small reddish-brown splotch a few feet from the spot. Blood. Ember made a quick note in her phone and took a picture to show Cedric later. The whole thing felt off to her. Could Underwood really have stolen the painting, hid it, and then hit himself hard enough on the back of his head to draw blood? There was no proof the curse was real. Why go to all that trouble? As Ember mulled over the case in her mind, a tall, thin man in a sharp blue suit rounded a nearby corner. He was James Connor, the museum curator. He was clearly flustered and didn't notice Ember until he almost ran into her. Oh, Connor said with surprise. I'm so sorry, Miss McNair. I've got a lot on my mind with, well, he gestured to the empty space on the wall. You know. Of course, Mr. Connor. Ember nodded. James Connor was chatty when he was nervous, and Ember was an easy audience for him to speak his piece. I'm just so relieved they found black seas. The museum would have been ruined if it was lost for good. Ruined? Inquired Ember. James chuckled nervously and adjusted his tie. Yes, well, you see, the Kokkamar Museum doesn't own black seas and dark skies. If it hadn't been found, we would have had to pay a hefty price to its owner. It's worth that much? Ember questioned. Do you think the thief could have sold it? Connor replied excitedly, Absolutely. A piece like that, people would pay top dollar, stolen or not. Huh? Tanner was a doctor, so I doubt he was hurting for money, Ember said, mostly for herself. James noticed the investigative glint in Ember's eyes and quickly changed the subject. Yes, well, what matters now is that the painting has been found. I look forward to its return. Ember turned to James. Yeah, I'm sure you do. James Connor smiled and began walking back to his office, but Ember stopped him. One more thing, James. He turned. Have you spoken recently to the former Mrs. Underwood? Chapter 4. After Ember left the museum, she dialed Cedric to see if he could give her more details on the case. To her delight, he answered. He already seemed to know what she was calling about. Well, it's definitely a murder investigation, Cedric greeted her wryly. It wasn't an accident or anything like that? Ember asked. Not unless people just accidentally naturally end up drowned in their living room, Cedric said. Ember gasped. That is strange. Any idea how it happened? The team is on it, Cedric told her. But I have to tell you, the weirdest part is the smell. Everything is all wet and has a stench like death. Well, the doctor is dead, Ember pointed out. No, Cedric said. Worse than that. I know what a dead body's supposed to smell like at this rate of composition, and this is much worse. Ember guessed it was particularly tough on his sensitive wolf olfactory senses. Not that she'd ever point that out to him. And what do you think about the curse? Cedric scoffed. I thought you were telling me just the other day that the curse wasn't real. Remember? The painting's been hanging in the museum for years and nothing bad has happened? Ember smiled at Cedric's recall of her own words from the other night. Yes, well, now something bad has happened. I'm not saying I believe in the curse, just that it's an avenue worth researching. Well, I'm determined to find a more plausible cause, Cedric remarked dryly, even if some of the other officers are refusing to walk into the evidence locker so long as that thing is in there. Ember wasn't surprised to hear this. If there was any group of people more superstitious than cops, she wasn't aware of them. Listen, I've just been at the museum, Ember said. I picked up some potentially interesting information. You might have it already. Hit me with it. We're at the we'll take whatever we can get stage of the investigation. Well, it looks like the painting was on loan to the museum, not owned or donated outright. So the curator, James Connor, you know the one, he would have been on the line for a good deal of money if the painting hadn't been recovered. Cedric made a noise of non-committal musing. I imagine that would put a good deal of strain on him. Ember rolled her eyes fondly. If Cedric wasn't picking up on her hints about James Connor having a potential motive for murder, then she might need to spell it out a little more. It seemed like it was more than a good deal of strain, Ember remarked. I'd say he was pretty desperate. Like, say he knew who had stolen the painting, knew that Matthew Tanner had done it. He might have killed him to ensure that the painting wasn't sold to another buyer and lost forever. Interesting theory, Cedric said, still infuriatingly unconvinced. Ember pressed on. That way, too, he could make sure the police recovered it. You were bound to find it if it turned up at a murder scene. If he knew or suspected the thief's identity, surely there would have been a better way to get the painting back than murder, Cedric said. He could have called in a tip. And is a phone tip enough for an immediate search warrant? Ember asked. Maybe James thought Dr. Tanner would get wind of it and sell the painting quickly if he did that. He had to act fast. Cedric didn't immediately object to that line of thinking, which Ember took as a victory of sorts. All right, Ember continued. And how about this one? Brent Underwood's scandalous personal ties to Dr. Tanner. Now that we did know about, Cedric answered. What are your thoughts? Sounds pretty infuriating, honestly. Brent could be forgiven for wanting revenge on the guy if that's how he felt. And besides, Brent was supposed to be the only one at the museum when he was hit on the head. He might have stolen the painting without any difficulty. But think what you're actually suggesting, Cedric said reasonably. Brent would have had to set the painting aside someplace, then seriously injure himself, just in order to plant the cursed painting in Tanner's house. There was blood on the floor, Ember. Brent is still in the hospital. That's a lot of faith in the power of a curse. I doubt he was thinking too objectively, Ember said. If he somehow got it in his head that it was the one way to get his woman back, then causing himself an injury, even a serious one, might have sounded worth it to him. Well, Cedric muttered slowly. The truth is that Brent's ex-wife did visit him in the hospital today, so maybe it's not such a wild thought after all. Ember grinned. I know well enough to quit when I'm ahead. See you later? As soon as I can get away, Cedric said. As you might easily imagine, it's pretty hectic around the department today. Koshimar's rumor mill was like a great rapid river, one that had a tendency to swirl and eddy right into the broken broom. Ember found that, so long as she kept her ears open, she tended to pick up on most of the day's topics of interest. Today's topic, of course, was Brent Underwood and the case of the cursed painting, which was how Ember ended up hearing later that day that Brent had been released from the hospital. The news didn't cause a general sense of relief and happiness like it might have done under other circumstances. More than half of the people whispering loudly about Brent seemed to think that the hospital had just released a murderer back into the populace. Ember was dutifully refraining from taking part in any of these discussions. Sure, she might be entertaining a similar theory herself, but that was between her and the police investigation. She didn't want to fuel the court of public opinion, which had a particularly vicious bite in this town. An attractive, well-dressed woman in her late 30s or 40s came striding up to the bar. She wasn't someone Ember knew by sight, but in a small town like Koshimar, everyone's a little familiar. Still, Ember stared at her curiously for a second before approaching her. The woman, evidently noticing the stare, sniffed. I'm Victoria, she said. Brent Underwood's ex-wife. The one who had left Brent for the recently deceased Dr. Matthew Tanner. Oh, said Ember. Yes, of course. Hello. Victoria sniffed. Listen, I know this might sound strange. I've wronged Brent in the past, and I'm very sorry for it now. I know Brent better than anyone else, and I know he would never intentionally hurt anyone, not even Matthew. Ember nodded, taking this in. Okay, she said. Well, I'm sure the investigation will... I can't trust any of that, Victoria said, eyes pleading. Listen, everyone knows you're the person people can go to when they're in trouble. Please, Ember McNair, would you help clear Brent's name? Chapter 5. The next day, Cedric dropped by the broken broom during a lull. Ember set down the book she'd been reading and beamed as he walked over to the bar. More news? She asked, already pouring him a coffee. He inclined his head with a smile. The painting has been returned to the museum. I'll bet James Connor is happy to hear that. That he is, Cedric said. Even happier now that the newly installed exhibit is already drawing significant crowds. Significant crowds, Ember echoed. I'll bet that will help with any and all financial troubles the museum has been facing, as well as its fastidious curator. Cedric smirked. You're still beating that drum? The case against James seems pretty thin to me. And yet everything is working out so well for him, Ember objected. He's a smart, put-together man. You don't think he could orchestrate something like this? Save the massive fee and stir up some prurient PR while he's at it? Seems like a lot of variables he'd have to juggle to pull it off, Cedric said. But fine. We'll look into it. Ember punched the air in a victorious gesture and then scooted Cedric's fresh coffee across the bar to him. What else have you guys figured out? Cedric took a long sip, clearly reluctant to part with this next piece of news. Ember could practically feel her ears pricking up in anticipation. Fine, Cedric said eventually. So remember how I said the crime scene smelled awful? Ember nodded. Well, the report says that Tanner wasn't drowned with water. He was drowned with turpentine. Ember blinked, confused. Turpentine? It was a strange, old-timey word, something she associated with retro television shows. She couldn't quite place what it was. Begrudgingly, Cedric ground out, "It's a paint thinner." "Oh," Ember said, lighting up. "Don't you get started on me," Cedric said pleadingly. Half the force already sees that as confirmation that the painting was actually responsible for the death. Ember groaned sympathetically. All right, I won't say it's clearly the cursed painting, but the fact that it's a paint thinner, doesn't that mean it could at least be someone trying to make it look like it's the cursed painting?" When Cedric didn't answer, she pressed on. "Like someone who maybe wanted the whole town to believe the painting was cursed?" "Which brings us back to your Jameis Connor theory," Cedric said with a smirk. "You're relentless. What happened to Brent Underwood? Yesterday you were telling me you thought he had bonked himself on the head and planted the curse on the doctor out of revenge." "Yeah," Ember said, laughing nervously. "About that. Brent's ex-wife sort of came in and asked me to help him out." Cedric raised both eyebrows. "And what, you're an investigator for hire now?" "No," Ember objected. "Definitely not. I told her I'd only help her if I was allowed to remain impartial, and she had to be open to the fact that I might find information that didn't look good for Brent." She agreed. She's got serious faith in him. "Yesterday, you would have told me that this was all part of Brent's plan to win her back," Cedric reminded her. "Yes," Ember agreed. "Maybe it is. It's certainly working, anyway. She's his biggest ally. From what I've heard, she might be the only person left in town who doesn't think he intentionally cursed Dr. Tanner to death," Cedric said wryly. "She told me a little bit more about his background, how he's been lately." Ember paused, wanting to make Cedric ask for it. He only gave her an expectant look, knowing she would cave before he did. Her natural enthusiasm didn't allow her to play coy when she was sitting on good information. He was right. Within seconds, Ember had caved and continued. "All right, so according to Victoria, Brent had been depressed ever since the divorce, in kind of a dark space. But she said, although she was always worried about him and the effect the divorce had on him, she never, ever felt like he might hurt anybody. Not even himself. She was very clear on that point, too. She says he's simply not the killer type." "Frankly, I agree," Cedric said. "But we've got to be extra thorough, especially since Brent used to be a cop." "Why especially?" Ember asked. "Surely that would be a reason to take it easy on him." "See? That attitude right there is why it's especially important. The public is always suspicious about crimes involving cops. If there's even a whiff that we aren't taking him seriously as a suspect, people will be crying out that we're covering it all up." "We'll look into it," Ember said. Cedric cut her a dubious look. "What?" she asked, batting her eyes innocently. "I do want you to. I don't work for Victoria. She's just distressed, and she has every right to be. But I think it's pretty telling that she's distressed on behalf of her ex-husband rather than the person she left him for, who's just been horrifically murdered. That's a pretty big statement in support of Brent's character, if you ask me." "But you can still remain impartial?" Cedric asked. "If you get new information, evidence that points at Brent, you'll take it seriously?" "Absolutely," Ember said. "I'm nothing if not a very ethical amateur sleuth." Cedric smirked. That he couldn't argue. "Well," he said, draining his coffee and rising from his bar stool. "In that case, I agree to investigate our museum curator. We'll look into the question of his recent financial issues, whether this is all some big scheme to draw attention to the museum." Ember was gratified to hear that he only sounded half as sardonic about the prospect as he had when he walked in 10 minutes ago. It was the small victories that tasted sweetest. Chapter 6. "I've got more goods," Sage said brightly as she approached the table Ember was wiping down. Ember, who hadn't seen Sage come in, jumped slightly and then turned to her friend, smiling. "You startled me." "Sorry," Sage said, wincing but also smiling sheepishly. "Listen, do you want my intel, or are you too busy right now?" Ember waved a hand around, gesturing to the nearly empty state of the broken broom. Sage smiled and sat at the table, then nodded at Ember to sit across from her. Ember did so, setting her rag aside. "I've been keeping my ears open around the store," Sage said. "Which isn't hard, because absolutely everyone is talking about this case. Mostly about the painting and the curse, of course, which I naturally find fascinating, but I thought you might like the slightly more concrete gossip I've found. I'm on tenterhooks, Ember said. All right. Sage clapped her hands and rubbed them together eagerly. Here's the thing. I overheard some guys chatting about Brent, about how he was after Victoria left him. It sounds like he was in a pretty rough state. That's what Victoria said, Ember agreed, nodding. That he was really depressed. But she said he wasn't about to hurt anyone. Sage shook her head. That's not what these guys said. According to them, he was really worked up, to an out-of-character degree. One of them said he'd even been pretty suicidal at times. Ember considered this. It was possible that Victoria hadn't been in a position to see Brent at his very worst during the divorce, or even that she willfully hadn't noticed that her leaving him had been enough to cause Brent to consider drastic self-harm. So perhaps Victoria's insistence that Brent wouldn't hurt anyone had a big blind spot in it, and should be taken with a grain of salt. Anyway, Sage continued, that was around when he quit his job as a detective at the sheriff's department. He got a job as a night watchman at the museum. So is Brent your favorite for the crime? Ember asked. Sage chewed this over a second, then eventually nodded. I think so. Not like I want him to be a cold-blooded killer, but sure, talk about motive. The problem really is that I don't know Brent myself, Ember said. I met him while he was half zonked out at the hospital, and I've heard his guilty ex-wife's account of who he is. I don't have any instincts about this guy. But you know who probably does? Already Ember was rising from the table. Sage followed her eagerly, all the way back to the office. Kaylee was curled into a tight ball on the desk on top of a cracked-open book, to all appearances sleeping. But Ember and Sage saw one ear rise and swivel toward them like a satellite dish, clearly listening in. Talako, Ember called once they were alone, with the office door closed behind them. Sometimes Talako didn't come when summoned. Occasionally he was busy or out of summoning range, but he'd been hanging around the broken broom pretty much full-time since this case began. For that reason, Ember wasn't all that surprised when he materialized seconds later. We were discussing the case, Ember said, trying to figure out if Brent Underwood was the kind of person who would intentionally harm someone. You spent a lot of time out at that museum. Even if you never interacted with Brent, did you get a sense of who he was? Talako took all this in with a thoughtful expression on his face. I suppose it's impossible ever to really know someone in that way, he said slowly. People are always capable of worse things than we feel we could expect. But no, I never would have thought it of Brent. He seemed a sad person, but not a cold-hearted one. Do you have any ideas who it might have been? Sage prompted. Talako cut a look from Sage to Ember and back again. Well, the curator, James. I know Ember has been considering him. And I don't mean to imply that he is a cold-hearted person, not at all. But I will say that his circumstances seemed pretty desperate. That's right, Ember said. Desperate people do desperate things. Talako nodded. Unlike Brent, who had had time to balm his wounds and would have had to plan the murder carefully, James could have been acting out of haste and passion. It would change the nature of the crime itself. And besides, I'm not sure that even a really desperate person would be able to hit themselves hard enough on the back of the head to be knocked out, Ember said. Already, she was reaching for her phone and dialing Cedric. Normally, Sage would have taken this opportunity to tease Ember about her relationship with Cedric. However, Sage's gossip-attuned ears had managed to catch wind of the fact that Cedric had proposed, and Ember was keeping him in limbo. Sage was not about to do or say anything that might inadvertently influence Ember against Cedric. Not right now. So she bit down on her tongue to keep her affectionate jibe from falling out of her mouth. Yeah? Cedric answered. Ember put him on speaker so everyone could hear the conversation. Hey, Ember said. Have you found anything out about the whole knocking yourself out question we talked about? Nah, the guys are going to run some tests to figure out if it's possible, Cedric said. We can't rule it out for sure until that happens. What exactly do those tests look like? Sage asked. Are the deputies going to be trying to knock themselves out right there in the department office? Hi, Sage, Cedric said dryly at her intrusion. You know, I'm mostly staying out of this one. I let the lab do what the lab does best and I accept the results. Just hoping we don't have to comp any hospital bills for this. You'll report back when you find out for sure? Ember asked. Sure will. Great, thanks. They said their goodbyes and hung up. In the brief silence that followed, Kaylee uncurled from her ball, yawned, and stretched elaborately, hunching her back in a high arc. Meanwhile, she said, I'll pause my research into memory spells. I think it's becoming pretty important to figure out whether it's actually possible for a painting to be cursed. Chapter 7. Just as the pub was starting to fill up for lunchtime, none other than Brent Underwood himself came in. Ember smiled as he approached the bar. He still looked a little worse for wear. A fresh gauze bandage was wrapped around his head, and he had that drawn, underslept look of a person who had recently been in the hospital. Hi, Ember, he said. I just came in for some lunch. What do you have today? Ember wasn't sure she believed that he was just stopping by for a meal. He'd hardly been a regular customer before all of this went down. However, he thought it likely that Brent knew Victoria had asked Ember to investigate the case on his behalf. Maybe he thought that, since Ember had agreed to do so, she might be a friendly face for him. She doubted there were very many friendly faces for Brent Underwood in Koshmar these days. Sure thing, Ember said brightly, fishing out a menu from under the bar and passing it over to him. For here or to go? Brent looked like he was considering the question for a second. He glanced over his shoulder and saw that several other customers were already throwing him suspicious, angry glances. Then, with a sad tone in his voice, he said, Better make it to go. After looking over the menu a while, he put in an order for a chili and cornbread meal. Ember walked the order back to the kitchen, then returned to the bar. By the time she made it back, a few of the other customers had already come up and surrounded Brent at his bar stool. Think you're doing here? One of them, a big burly man, said in a menacing voice. Bold of you to show your face out and around in this town, said another guy, less meaty but taller and angrier looking. You'd think you'd have figured out by now that nobody wants you around. But maybe you're having a little difficulty getting that concept through your thick skull, growled the burly guy. I don't know what you're talking about, Brent objected, voice shot through with fear. I'm just here for a little lunch. I promise I'll get right out of your hair. You know what's the only thing worse than a dirty cop, Harv? The tall guy asked his muscular friend. What's that, Bill? The musclehead, Harv, asked. A double-crossing murderer, Bill spat out. I'm not a murderer, Brent said. He wasn't speaking very loudly, and Ember doubted the men were listening to him. You know, I was hurt too. Dr. Matthew Tanner was an amazing person, said Bill, handily talking over Brent and drowning him out completely. He's treated me and my family for years. Now he's dead, because of you. He was a brilliant man, Harv added. He didn't deserve to die. I agree, Brent said. I don't think he deserved to die. I don't think anyone deserves to die. The men didn't look like they were going to back off. Since they weren't troubling at all to keep their voices down, their antics had drawn the attention of just about everyone in the dining area. From every table and bar stool, people were craning around, rubbernecking to see what was going on. But no one looked like they were going to intervene. If anything, Ember was nervous that some of them appeared tempted to join in on the harassment. If anyone was going to step in, it would have to be Ember herself. She strode up to stand across from the men at the bar. At all of 5'2", she knew she was hardly an intimidating sight, and under normal circumstances, she doubted she could have even gotten these men's attention, when they were so clearly set on continuing to pile onto Brent. But there was something to be said about being the owner of Koshamar's only watering hole. Nobody wanted to get on Ember's bad side, particularly not when they were standing right there in her bar. Excuse you, she said sharply to both of them. I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you gentlemen to leave Brent alone. Harvey scowled at Ember, The muscles of his neck seemed to bulge intimidatingly with the expression. "What's it to you?" He griped at her. She might easily have been frightened of him. He was a frightening man. But just at that moment, she reminded herself that, if it ever should become necessary, she could probably turn him into a frog. Not for long, of course. And she'd never do it. Not really. But it was good to think about the fact that, if she had to, she could. And it was much easier to stare him down when she pictured him as a swollen-throated, ribbiting amphibian. "I'd like to keep my establishment civil and pleasant for everyone, and you two are causing a scene," she snapped back at him. To her immense gratification, he did look a little chastened. "Besides," she continued, feeling heartened, "need I remind everyone that Brent got seriously hurt in the art theft? He was hospitalized for days." She glared at Harv and Bill, then outward to the rest of the onlooking crowd. "People do not just go around conking themselves on the head and knocking themselves out," she said. Never mind that she had entertained the same notion, had even encouraged the local police to test out the theory. What mattered now wasn't Ember's private opinion, but Brent's safety. Ember was glad when Harv and Bill left the pub grumbling. Several others stood up and left too. Ember guessed that she might have lost a couple customers by publicly siding with Brent. Oh well. They would come back when the case was settled. That was always the way it went. "Thanks," Brent muttered to Ember, standing and starting to shuffle off. "Wait," Ember said, then went back to the kitchen, where the chef was just finishing boxing up Brent's order. She brought it out to him, then he paid, and left. As she watched him go, she couldn't help but worry about his well-being. This town did have a history of acting like a lynch mob. Even if no one openly jumped at him, she knew how powerful and upsetting this town's ill treatment could be. She didn't want Brent ending up in a low place like he'd been in when Victoria left him. This case needed to be solved, and fast. Chapter 8. Ember sighed as she poured herself some tea and stared at the yucca plant in the corner of her room. She was still thinking about how Brent had been treated by the other customers in the bar earlier. She hoped he would be okay. Her mind wandered back to the needless death of Matthew Tanner, a man who spent his life saving others. She didn't know much about the good doctor, but maybe if she took a look around his home, she might find something that would be of help. "Kaylee, hold down the fort, would you?" Ember called into the quiet apartment. Her familiar, wherever she was, didn't reply. She drained the last of her tea. With a self-assuring nod, she closed her eyes and thought about Matthew's house. Ember knew she had arrived in the doctor's house when her nostrils were suddenly assaulted by the foul odor that had been present when his body was found. It was damp and heavy, making her stomach churn and causing her face to scrunch. She took out a handkerchief and covered her nose while she made her way through a door that looked like an office. There was an antique desk facing the window that held a smart pen holder, a stapler, and a small laptop. Ember was relieved that all his effects hadn't yet been collected by the sheriff's office as she flipped open the laptop and turned it on. Damn, it required a password. She moved her gaze to the right side of the desk, which had 3 drawers. She noticed a small lock on the top drawer but gave the handle a tug. It slid open. There was a small tin of mints, some paper clips, and a notebook. This Ember flicked through, but there wasn't much of interest in it. The next drawer's contents were equally as bland. But the last drawer revealed a stack of papers. Carefully, Ember pulled them out and placed them on the desk. The paperwork she came to first was a receipt for a rather generous donation to a children's charity, and as she continued to search, she discovered more and more charitable contributions for various good causes. It appeared that the good doctor was also a good man. Ember continued to look through the paperwork. Tucked away at the very bottom of the pile was an unmarked manila folder. She sat in the swivel chair and opened it. The folder contained articles about black seas and dark skies. There were also notes about the artist and the painting that Matthew Tanner had made. Ember sat back. So, Matthew was interested in the painting after all. She had to wonder if he did indeed steal the painting for himself, ultimately causing his own death. So Ember was pulled from her thoughts by the sound of keys being turned in the lock of the front door. In a blind panic, she scraped the papers and folder back into the drawer. Who else even had a key to the doctor's house? Before she had time to think about it, she closed her eyes and, accompanied by a soft poof sound, apparated out of there. That evening, just before closing, Ember was downstairs in the pub and noticed an assembly of apparitions by the cozy fireplace. It was Talako, and he'd brought some friends. Ember checked that the last of the stragglers had left the pub before moving over to find out what was going on. It was then she noticed Sage sitting in one of the wing-backed chairs by the fireplace. "Hi, Talako Sage," she said, her eyebrows knitted in curiosity. "What's going on? You're not hoping to have another birthday party here for one of your ghostly friends, are you?" Sage laughed and looked to Talako, who indicated for her to answer. "No, silly. These guys are all previous owners of the painting. Talako thought it might help you if he rounded them up." Ember's face transformed into one of delight. "Wow, that's a great idea. I love it when I can get information that's unavailable to the police." Talako smiled and folded his arms. "I am wise beyond my years, little one." "You are. You make Yoda look like a dunce," she enthused with a flick of her eyebrows. Sage laughed, but Talako just narrowed his eyes at her. "Who's Yoda?" Ember threw up her hands, and Sage shook her head. "He's a short, squat guy with big ears, but let's get back to your friends here." Ember smiled at each of the 4 ghostly figures, who nodded a greeting back to her. There was one woman who looked to be in her 30s and 3 older gentlemen, all dressed in appropriate apparel for their time. "Firstly," Sage began, "I had to translate as Mrs. Boudoir is French and Mr. something Russian you wouldn't be able to pronounce, doesn't speak English either." Ember took a step back to regard her friend. "I didn't know you spoke all those languages." "I have so many hidden talents I felt it would be showing off to let you in on all of them." Ember gave her friend a withering look before grinning at her. "Anyway, what I found out was that Mrs. Boudoir was murdered by her lover. The Russian guy died of natural causes, and so did Mr. Grantchester. There was nothing weird or supernatural about their deaths." One of the ghosts stepped forward, an old man with wiry white hair and slight hunch in his shoulders. "Unfortunately, people buy paintings and people die," he managed, his voice gravelly and low. "There isn't a connection. It's just a fact of life, I'm afraid." Ember smiled at the man and pursed her lips. It had been useful to find out what had become of the previous owners. But now that it seemed the curse on the painting was obviously not real, clearly Ember needed to dig deeper to find out what really happened to Dr. Tanner. Chapter 9. Sage and Talako waited for the lunchtime rush to subside before appearing in the bar of the Broken Broom. Ember was cleaning tables and refilling salt pots when they arrived. "Hi, Ember," Sage called from the doorway. "My store wasn't busy, so I grabbed Talako. Thought we could have a chat about the case if you're not too busy." Ember smiled and held her hand up in greeting. "As long as you don't mind if I keep working. I'm a staff member short for the afternoon. Annie had a dentist appointment." "Your generation eats too much sugar," Talako offered as his greeting. "You're just jealous because you never had the choice," Sage said. Talako was staring at the picture of a sticky toffee pudding on the back of the menu and sighed. "It does look good, but is it worth you losing your teeth over?" Sage and Ember looked at each other and grinned. "Absolutely." Talako shook his head in despair. "So, do you guys have any news?" Ember asked. "Yes," said Talako. "I took it upon myself." "At my suggestion," Sage interrupted. Talako gave her a lip curl and a shoulder shrug. "Whatever," he said in his best American teenage accent. Sage and Ember giggled and let Talako continue. "I have been frequenting the medical examiner's office in the hope of finding out some helpful information. That is not a nice place. There are bodies in drawers, and they have a ritual of slicing a Y shape into the body." He fought back. Sage slumped on her stool, unable to wait for Talako to get to the point. "It seems that the doctor wasn't killed by a cursed painting at all." "What signs of struggle were there?" Ember inquired. Talako continued. There was bruising on his arms and skin under his fingernails, as well as a, previously unnoticed, blow to his head. The DNA doesn't match anyone in the current system, and although they have taken samples from Brent and James, apparently it takes a long time to get results. So Ember stopped filling the salt shaker and sat at the table. So, the painting is well and truly cleared of murder, then? You look disappointed, Sage, she said lightly. I am a bit. The thought of a cursed painting being the murderer is so much more exciting than a human with a personal grudge. True, Ember mused. Although, Sage pointed out, just because the painting wasn't the actual cause of death, it could still be cursed. True again, but if it is cursed and nobody who's owned it has ever died under mysterious circumstances, then it's not really the scariest curse ever, is it? Talico held a snigger. Once he composed himself, he gazed at the ceiling as if recalling a treasured memory. My father was a man who knew how to curse someone. I remember one time when strangers invaded our land and took our livestock. My father placed a curse upon them. By nightfall, they were found floating up the river. He smiled reflectively. I was the one who found them. Ember looked from Talico to Sage, who rolled her eyes before jumping off her stool. See you guys on the dark side. Sage grabbed her bag and blew a friendly kiss before leaving. Ember was relieved to have Annie back from the dentist and working as Cedric stopped by to ask if she would like him to cook her dinner that evening. She had accepted gratefully, as she could do with a break from the pub and the locals gossiping about who killed the doctor and what they would like to do to them. Cedric arrived by 6 o'clock, carrying a bag of groceries and a decent bottle of red wine. Ember opened the door and smiled. Her tummy flipped at his handsome features and hazel eyes, which were sparkling just for her. You look gorgeous, he said, scanning Ember from head to toe. He kissed her lightly on the lips before giving her the bottle of wine. They moved through to the kitchen, where Cedric unpacked his bag and announced, I'm making you my specialty lasagna. Sounds lovely, Ember said, placing the wine on the side and grabbing one she had already opened. Cedric flung a tea towel over his shoulder and began chopping onions. I'll pour us some wine, then tell you what I found at the doctor's house, she said. Go on, hit me with your news, and then any talk of murder is off limits for the rest of the night. Fair enough. Ember nodded in agreement. I found some paperwork in a folder inside one of the desk drawers. Cedric looked up briefly from his chopping. I assume there was something of interest in there? There were a few receipts from donations he'd made to worthwhile charities. And then I found a folder with newspaper and magazine articles on the painting. Cedric paused again. So he definitely knew about the painting before he was killed. Yep, and there were some notes about it in his handwriting, too. Cedric glanced at his phone. I'll get an officer to go and collect it, but no more talk of murder. This is our date night. Ember couldn't help but be impressed. The lasagna was delicious. She looked up at Cedric, who was talking animatedly about the view from the top of the mountain he had run up earlier. The company's delicious, too, she thought as the corners of her mouth lifted. Come on. Cedric stood and banged his hands on the table. I challenge you to a game of Pinochle. Ember narrowed her eyes at him, then smiled. You're on. Cedric was a perfect gentleman when Ember beat him twice, but she could tell he wasn't used to losing. Why don't we play Go Fish, she suggested. Cedric lifted his chin and gave her a steely stare. Okay, but I must warn you I was third-grade champion, and I haven't let my training slip. Ember giggled and gave him an affectionate slap on the arm before dealing the cards. He was indeed champion of Go Fish and won easily, but after 2 games they left the cards and lit the fire, even though it wasn't really cold enough. Come over here, Cedric said as he held his hand out for Ember to join him on the sofa. Ember was happy to oblige as she nestled in his arms and breathed in his musky scent. They deliberately avoided any talk of marriage, which might have changed the mood. Instead, they kissed softly and wound themselves ever tighter in each other's arms. It was almost 2 a.m. when Cedric gave Ember one last lingering kiss before leaving. She sighed as she closed the door behind him, feeling a little sad that such a wonderful evening had ended. Chapter 10. Ember and Kylie went to the museum the next morning. "I'll just wait out here, shall I?" Kylie asked, parking herself outside and near the door. "If you'd be so kind," Ember said. "I probably won't be long." She was the first visitor to walk through the doors. However, she knew she wouldn't be the last that day. The painting and the mystery surrounding it had caught plenty of attention, but she needed to catch James while he was alone. Ember still had questions about James's involvement in the mystery surrounding Dr. Tanner's death and Brent's injuries. She had to try approaching him about things directly. She hoped that he would respond well to her questioning. James Connor was just starting his morning. He was about to go back to his office and make a few phone calls. However, he liked to walk through the museum right before it opened. His trip had taken a bit longer than usual today. After all of the hullabaloo about the supposedly cursed painting, he wanted to make sure everything else was where it should be. As he was looking at the latest display, Ember walked up to him. "Mr. Connor," she said with a smile, "it's lovely to see you." "Ah, yes, Ember. I hope you're having a pleasant morning. Is there something I can help you with?" "I just thought I'd look at a few paintings. Actually, while I have you, I was wondering about a few things." "Oh? What can I help you with? Is your question regarding our exhibits?" "Not quite," she said, shaking her head. "Actually, it's about the night Brent was hurt." James noticeably tensed up. Ember had a hard time reading the meaning of his reaction. "Yes, that was a truly unfortunate incident," he said. "Were you in the building the night he was injured?" "No, I was not." His eyes narrowed. "Are you trying to imply something?" "I'm not trying to imply anything," Ember said. "I just want to make sure that we're leaving no stone unturned. That's all." "Well, then you should be speaking to others. I was not in the building that night, and I don't know any more than the next person about what's been going on." Ember knew that James was going to have little patience for her questions. She had to choose her words carefully, or else he might cut off the conversation altogether. "I just want to find out what everyone knows about the situation. That way we can get closer to catching the real culprit." "You're not going to find out anything from talking to me," James said. "I wasn't in the museum that night, and if you're hinting at me being involved, then you should know that Brent is a dear friend of mine and I would never hurt him. I'm not trying to accuse you of anything. We're simply trying to find out who could have hurt Brent and Dr. Tanner." "I wouldn't risk my reputation over some painting," James said, straightening his tie. "I've worked hard for my reputation. I want to protect my art, but I need to protect myself first." James sounded sincere to Ember. She didn't think he was lying, but her gut was telling her that there was something more to the story. She wondered if James was really as innocent as he was making himself out to be. "Of course you wouldn't," Ember said. "I know your reputation is held in very high regard." "In any case," James said with a sniff, "the museum is doing quite well. We aren't having to worry much about finances, even with the current predicament. There would be no reason to hurt one of my own employees, nonetheless a dear friend." Ember smiled at him. "Thank you for answering my questions." "Yes, well, please enjoy the rest of your visit." He turned on his heel and walked off. Ember exited the museum and headed back toward the pub, Kaylee trotting after her. "Well?" Kaylee asked after they had gone a few blocks. "I'm just thinking about my conversation with James," Ember admitted. "I know that he's hiding something, but I have no idea what." When they made it back to the broken broom, Ember plopped down onto one of the seats in the back of the pub and pulled out her phone to call Cedric. Kaylee jumped gracefully from the floor onto the tabletop. She looked at Ember with big eyes as Ember pulled up Cedric's number. "Sheriff Jameson," Cedric answered. "Cedric, hi, it's Ember." "Hello, Ember," he said. "To what do I owe the pleasure of hearing your voice?" Ember giggled to herself and blushed. She couldn't help but to swoon over Cedric. However, she needed to get down to business. "I just got back from talking to James. I went to ask him about his whereabouts when Brent was hurt." "Oh, what did you find out?" "He claims that he wasn't at the museum that night. He also mentioned that Brent is a good friend of his." Do you believe him? Cedric asked. I do, but I still have a nagging feeling in the back of my mind. I think that he may be innocent of this, but maybe there's more to the story. I think you should trust your gut on it, then. I'm glad you trust my gut, too, Ember said. It's gotten us out of some hairy situations, Cedric said. If James didn't have anything to do with the theft, that means that Matthew likely stole the painting himself. It does seem that way. Still, there's plenty that I don't understand. I think there's a lot more to this mystery. We have a likely suspect for the theft, but that suspect is unfortunately deceased. But that leaves a big question, Ember said. Who killed Matthew? It's possible that he didn't act alone. He could have had an accomplice. If he did, then that person is either in danger or maybe the murderer. Both seem just as likely right now, Cedric said. It's just a theory right now, but perhaps it's a thread we should look into. I think you're right, Ember said. It's early still. I think I need to make another trip back to the museum. Maybe the painting can tell us something that James couldn't. Chapter 11. Ember made her way back to the museum. She hoped that the painting would give her the answers that she needed. As she walked back into the museum, she wondered if there was something that she had missed. She went over all of the facts in her head. There were still pieces of the story missing. Hopefully, the painting would be the missing piece. Ember arrived at the painting and looked up at it. She hoped that, hidden somewhere in the brushstrokes, she would find the identity of the murderer. However, no such secret message existed. Ember stared at the painting, still trying to discern some sort of hidden meaning, when she saw someone walk up next to her. She turned to the other person and smiled. Hello. This art attracts quite a crowd, doesn't it? She joked. So I've heard. Unfortunately, it's not for the right reasons, he said. He was a well-dressed man, blonde, clean-shaven, and tanned. Ember didn't think she'd ever seen him before, but there was something familiar about him. I suppose not, Ember said. Still, it's a very nice painting. Yes, the man conceded, but his tone was dark. Though I can't say I enjoy looking at it. Because of the murder? Yes. Unfortunately, it was my brother who passed away. Oh my goodness, Ember said. This must be George Tanner, she realized. She hadn't recognized him for himself, but rather for his resemblance to his brother. I'm so sorry. He looked at her as if trying to measure her sincerity. It's all right. I'm not looking for sympathy. I'm looking for answers. Have you found any? Ember asked. George sighed. I'm afraid not. I can't figure out why all of this would happen over a painting. Did he usually like paintings like this? Well, that's the thing. He really didn't. He liked classic art, Baroque. Rubens was his favorite. I'm afraid this painting isn't quite like Rubens, Ember said. She began to wonder what would have brought Dr. Tanner to steal a painting that wasn't even in his favorite style. It's nothing like the art he used to collect, George admitted. Besides, it's not like he was ever hurting for money. He had plenty of it, and even if he didn't, the family did. James walked towards the painting with a group of other museum workers. He looked surprised to see Ember again. I'm sorry, but this display is now temporarily closed, James said. What? Why? Ember asked. George also looked confused. Due to the increase in public interest in the piece, we're going to do some restoration work. It will be back up and ready to be viewed before you know it. Ember knew that this was a canned response. She was about to ask how long the restoration would take when another man, older and tougher looking than George and dressed incongruously in a baseball cap, walked up to the display. Oh, are you taking it down? The man asked. I was hoping to see it. I'm sorry, James said. This piece was due for restoration, and the increased public interest has caused us to move its restoration appointment up quite a bit. That's disappointing. I would have liked to have seen it longer. James and the other museum workers took down the painting and left with it. Ember, George, and the other man continued to linger nearby. Ember let out a sigh of frustration. The painting hadn't inspired her to think of the evidence she had in a different way like she had hoped. The painting that was supposed to be both a muse and a key piece of evidence had now disappeared into the back of the museum. "I think it's time for me to leave," George said. "It was nice meeting you. I'm sorry, I don't remember your name?" "Ember," she told him warmly. "I run the Broken Broom in town. And you're George, aren't you? I'm really very sorry for your loss." "Yes," George said solemnly. "Thank you. I am too." George walked off, leaving Ember and the other man looking at the place where the painting had been. There was now a placard explaining that the exhibit was temporarily closed. "It really is a shame about that painting," said the man again. "I would have liked to see it. I was hoping to get some closure over the death of the doctor." "Did you know him?" Ember asked. "I did. My wife was one of his patients. It was such a shock to hear what happened." "Yes, it was. I'm Ember, by the way. Ember McNair." She held out her hand to him. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Ember. My name is Lorne White," he said, shaking her hand. "It's nice to meet you, too." "I wish I met you under better circumstances," he joked. "It really is a shame that Matthew stole that painting. I keep racking my brain, but I can't figure out a reason why." Ember nodded sympathetically. "I know what you mean. It seemed very out of character for him." "How tragic for his life to be cut short," Lorne said. Then, looking back at the placard, he added, "Have you heard about the curse on the painting? It's really very strange. Maybe it's for the best that the painting was taken down after all. That way it can't hurt anyone else." "Yes, I've heard about it. I don't put much stock into it, though." He looked surprised. "You don't?" "No. I think there's a human reason behind what happened," Ember said. "I believe that he was murdered." Lorne shook his head. "That seems to be the more obvious answer, but I can't think of a reason why someone would want to do such a horrible thing. As unbelievable as it sounds, I think that the curse really was what killed him." "Maybe," Ember said. She didn't believe that the curse was behind the death of the doctor, but she didn't want to upset a man in mourning either. "Well, I better be off," he said. "If I can't see the painting, I'm afraid I didn't have much more reason to be here." "In any case, it was nice meeting you," Ember said. "Hopefully we'll find out what happened to Dr. Tanner soon." "Yes, I do hope so," Lorne said. "Have a pleasant day." He walked away from the exhibit, leaving Ember alone. She looked back to the place where the painting was. If it wasn't going to give her answers, she was determined to find them some other way. Chapter 12. Cedric picked up his phone to call Ember. He needed to tell her more news about the case. "Hello?" she answered. He felt his heart begin to beat a bit faster. Though he was just calling for business, he couldn't help but enjoy hearing her voice. "Hello, Ember," he said. "It's Cedric. I wanted to go over a few things about the case with you." "All right. I have a free moment. Let's go over them." "Well, I think it's clear at this point that Matthew took a chunk out of whoever was involved in his murder." "Could it be Brent or James?" "It's possible, but when I interviewed them, neither seemed to have any scratches." "Could they have been hiding it?" "It's possible," he said, "but without more reason to hold them, we can't be certain." Ember paused to consider. She was still having trouble making sense of the case. Kaylee gave her an encouraging meow. What if they were in on it together? She speculated. "Together?" Cedric asked. Maybe Brent and Matthew had a plan to steal the painting. Brent could have turned on him and told James. That's possible, but it still doesn't explain why Matthew would need to steal the painting in the first place. He could have just bought it. Ember sighed. "I feel like there are too many suspects and not enough suspects all at once," she said. "I know how you feel," Cedric reassured her. "This is a tough case to crack." Ember was straightening up the kitchen in her apartment when a bat flew in through the open window. She was just about to grab a broom to shoo the animal out when it transformed into Sage, her best friend. Ember laughed. You certainly know how to make an entrance. Of course. I wouldn't want you to expect anything less from me, Sage said. I never would. What brings you here? Sage sat down at Ember's kitchen table and made herself comfortable. Well, I have news. Someone has recently claimed the top spot of most eligible bachelor. Oh, really? Who is that? I thought you wouldn't be interested given that you're always making goo-goo eyes at Cedric, Sage joked. She dragged out his name and winked at Ember. Ember gave her a look. Don't tease, she said. Now, were you going to tell me this news or not? Oh, you know I am, Sage said. Anyway, it's George Tanner. George Tanner? I just met him. Really? You'll have to tell me all about him. Did you give him my number? No, I didn't give him your number. Why would I do such a thing? I didn't even know he was single. Oh, he's single, all right, Sage said. And he's about to be filthy rich. What do you mean? Ember went over to the stove to heat up the kettle to make some tea. Well, it turns out he was set to inherit his brother's estate. And now he doesn't have to share his family inheritance with his brother either. The gears in Ember's mind began to turn. She knew the Tanner family was wealthy. Now it seemed that George was in line to inherit 100% of the family fortune and his brother's money from his successful career. What else have you heard? Ember asked. Only that he's already staying in his late brother's big empty house. He's supposedly staying there until after the funeral. I wonder if he needs some company. Ember rolled her eyes. You're ridiculous. She carefully selected a tea bag and dropped it in an empty mug, then turned to the kettle, waiting for the water to heat up. After Sage talked her ear off about George Tanner, she transformed back into a bat and flew out of Ember's kitchen window. Kaylee watched with big eyes as she did so. Ember scooped up Kaylee and grabbed her phone on the way down to the pub. She needed to touch base with Cedric to tell him what she'd learned. Calling me back so soon? He said. I'm sorry if I'm bothering you. You could never bother me. What's up? Sage just stopped by, Ember explained. She had some interesting things to tell me about George Tanner, Matthew's brother. Oh, what did she say? Apparently he's not set to gain his brother's estate and his brother's half of the family fortune as well. He'd be set for life 3 or 4 times over with that sort of money. I would call that a potential motive. It doesn't really solve our problem with having both too many and not enough suspects, though. I still think you should look into him, she said. He may be willing to talk. And, more importantly, he may have the scratch marks we're looking for. I'll be sure to look into him, he promised. Is there anything else I should know about him? Sage mostly talked about him being a bachelor. He's staying at Matthew's house until the funeral, at least. Great. Then we know where to reach him. She heard Cedric shuffle some papers around. I have to go for now, he explained. But call me if you hear anything else. I'll keep you updated. I will. Bye now. Later, Ember went around making sure the pub was locked up for the night. It was her nightly routine. It was hard for her to sleep unless she knew everything was secure. She locked the doors and windows and made her way around the pub, straightening up. However, something caught her eye as she moved past the front counter. She picked up a note she hadn't seen before. The note was folded up scrap paper. When she opened it, she saw big block letters staring back at her. Drop it, the note read in all capital letters. Ember's hands began to shake as she read it. She was startled at the thought that there was someone in her space without her knowing. However, she also felt a rush of anger. How dare someone come into her pub and leave her nasty notes? She knew that the note had to be about the murder case. Ember didn't like being threatened. Chapter 13. After she received the threat, Ember needed a night to unwind. How about we go out tonight? Cedric had asked. Just forget about the case for a little bit. It'll help us to take a break, come back refreshed. I guess you're right, Ember said. A little distraction couldn't hurt. When Ember told Sage about her plans for the evening, Sage cheerily suggested making it a double date. "I've got this new boyfriend, Greg," Sage said over the phone to Ember. "He seems really nice so far, but I'm still getting a feel for him. I'd love to see how he is around other people." "That sounds great, Sage," Ember responded. "I'd love to meet him, and having you two there will force Cedric and me not to talk about the murder." At 7:30, Ember leaned on Cedric outside the restaurant while they waited for Sage and Greg to arrive. "Hey, there they are," Ember called out as she saw Sage and her boyfriend approach from the parking lot. "Hey," Sage replied loudly and ran up to Ember, gripping her in a tight embrace. Greg approached behind her. "Greg, this is Ember," Sage said when he'd gotten close enough. "She's like my best friend, and this is Cedric, her fiancé. I mean, her boyfriend." Ember gave Sage an indignant look and Sage responded by scrunching up her face. She couldn't take back what she'd said. "Hi, Greg. Nice to meet you," Cedric said and held out a hand. The tension Sage had created was obvious, and he was eager to break it fast. "Nice to meet you, too," Greg replied, clearly unsure what to make of what just happened. Ember finally broke her exasperated gaze from Sage and spoke up. "All right, shall we go in?" The four were seated, and any remaining tension soon dissipated. "So, Greg," Ember asked, "tell us something about yourself." "Oh, Greg was flustered by being put on the spot, and Sage hastily flew in to save him. "Greg's amazing," she said, enunciating every syllable with utmost clarity. "He's like a science genius." "Babe," Greg spoke up, "don't oversell me." Greg turned to Cedric and Ember, saying, "I'm more of a hobbyist than a genius." "Still," Cedric began, "that's very interesting. Any particular fields you're interested in?" Warming up to the conversation, Greg started talking about his interest in biology. "I'm especially fond of researching Cauchemar's flora and fauna. There's so much fascinating stuff that happens here that no one seems to notice." "Really?" Ember looked at him inquisitively. "Like what?" "I suppose it's the situation in most places, really. But Cauchemar has so much that's yet to be explored. The variety of ecosystems here are all like tiny, unknown worlds right under the surface." Sage and Ember shared a knowing look, seeing as they were part of one of Cauchemar's unknown worlds. "Because Cauchemar is a small town, a lot of people are eager to get away," Greg continued. "But there's so much here we still don't know about." "That's fascinating, Greg," Cedric piped in. "What sort of research do you do?" Greg latched onto this question, and he and Cedric were soon engaged in intense conversation. For a man so interested in the fantastic elements of the world around them, Greg was strangely pragmatic. Cedric liked this, and the two were locked in conversation for the rest of the night. Sage and Ember listened intently, occasionally inserting a question or idea. The four had a great night, and Sage was happy her new boyfriend seemed to get along so well with her friends. But after dinner and a half-hearted discussion about how to split the check, the two couples split for the evening. Cedric drove Ember back to her apartment above the pub, and the couple talked about how great Greg seemed for Sage. Cedric, always the gentleman, walked Ember inside. Once they were alone, he tilted her head up toward his and bent down to kiss her, softly at first, and then with building passion. When they parted for breath, Ember stood with her arms draped around Cedric's neck and rested her head on his chest. He rested his head on top of hers before speaking. "I just want you to know, I understand you taking your time." Ember asked, even though she knew exactly what Cedric meant. "The proposal. Take as much time as you need," Cedric responded. "I won't rush you, because I know you're perfect for me." Ember smiled and buried her face deeper into Cedric's warm chest. "I appreciate that, Cedric." The two snuggled for some time before Cedric finally pulled away. "I should get going," he said. "Early morning tomorrow." "All right," Ember replied, holding his hands in hers. They kissed once more, and just like that, Cedric was gone. Ember locked the door behind him and walked to her bedroom. Inside, she collapsed, face first, onto her bed. Kaylee, who had been asleep on Ember's pillow, stood up and stretched. She trilled and walked over to Ember, pushing her small head against Ember's. "So," Kaylee asked, "how was it?" Ember flipped over so she could look Kaylee in the eyes. "It was good." Ember smiled and averted her gaze. "I could see having nights like that all the time." "It's a good thing that's an option then," Kaylee responded. The cat nuzzled up in the crook of Ember's arm and lay back down. Ember started scratching behind Kaylee's ears, to which Kaylee happily closed her eyes and extended her neck. "I know you're right, Kaylee," Ember said, still scratching. "It's just..." "Just what?" Kaylee asked. "I don't want to get my heart broken," Ember whispered. "Cedric is the man of my dreams. He's everything I've ever wanted and more. But what if it doesn't work out? What if something terrible happens?" Kaylee pulled her head away and looked at Ember admonishingly. "And? Are you really going to live your whole life in fear about what might happen?" I know, Ember replied. "It is a little silly, I guess." "Not to mention," Kaylee said, "your heart isn't the only one on the line here. How will Cedric feel if you say no?" Ember sighed. "You're right as usual, Kaylee." "Of course I am," Kaylee replied smugly before laying her head down. Ember closed her eyes and thought about what life would be like as Mrs. Cedric Jameson. Maybe this risk was worth the reward. Chapter 14. Still swirling with thoughts about Cedric and his proposal, Ember drifted through most of her shift at the pub the next day. Her waitresses tittered and teased her, but she barely paid them any notice. For once, she was in the middle of a murder case, but instead of dwelling obsessively over the grisly details, her head was in the clouds. All of that came crashing down, of course, when Brent Underwood walked into the pub and quickly approached Ember, clearly in distress. "What's the matter?" she asked. "I wouldn't bother you with it normally," he said, speaking too quickly and stumbling slightly over his words. "A little rough treatment from people around town that I can take. But it was a couple of cops, Ember, following me, shouting about how I'm guilty. I used to work with them, and they think that I..." He trailed off, overcome with emotion and unable to finish the thought. Ember set her hand on his arm in what she hoped was a reassuring manner. If only he was in the know, she had some spells she might have been able to use to help calm him down. As it was, this was the best she could do. Well, she might also pour him a stiff drink, but it was only the early afternoon, so maybe that wasn't the best idea. "Please," Brent said faintly, "please help me." There was something vulnerable and frightened in Brent's tone, something that tugged at Ember's heartstrings. This was how she always ended up getting involved in these cases. Some helpless, powerless person giving her that exact same pleading expression. Ember couldn't help but have compassion for everything Brent had gone through. His wife divorced him, he quit his job, he was seriously injured in an art heist only to leave the hospital facing widespread gossip and suspicion. And now his ex-coworkers from the sheriff's department, people he probably used to be friends with, were following him around and accusing him of murder? If it was happening to Ember, she wasn't sure what she would do. Well, that wasn't quite true. She'd gone through a similar thing herself, minus the wife skipping out and the conch on the head, that is. And it had been absolutely terrible. Now Brent was whimpering slightly, worked up into a panicky state. Under her palm, his arm was trembling. "Please help me," he'd asked. What could she do? Ember steeled herself and nodded. "I'll do the best I can." Once she had managed to calm Brent down enough that he felt comfortable heading home, Ember knew what she had to do next. Kaylee caught up with Ember as she headed back toward the office. "What are you going to do about that?" Ember shrugged. "Nothing I can do, really, except try to work this case double time." It would be good for her to take her mind off the Cedric question for a while anyway. Get some distance and perspective. "Where are you going?" Kaylee asked, curious. "I'm going to go grab a slice of that shepherd's pie," Ember answered, "and hope that it helps me get better acquainted with the new boy in town." Armed with a piping hot-to-go box and a brown sack, Ember stood on the porch of what had once been Dr. Matthew Tanner's house and rapped at the door. Of course, it was possible George Tanner was out and about somewhere in town, but his shiny Porsche was parked in the driveway, so she thought there was a good chance he'd be around. Indeed, after about half a minute had passed, George came to the door. He looked confused that there was anyone at the door, but he was dressed just as nicely as he'd been when they met at the museum the other day. Either he was expecting company or he was somehow the kind of guy who chose to wear a suit and cufflinks while hanging around the house on his own. "Hey there," Ember said, smiling brightly and holding out the sack. "Shepherd's pie? It's one of our many specialties." George blinked at her, and for a second she worried he would take the bag and ask her to leave. Or worse, not take the bag at all. However, after a second's hesitation, he smiled faintly and opened the door farther. "Ember, wasn't it? From the pub? You want to come in?" At the sheriff's department, Cedric sat at the desk in his office, clicking through evidence files on his computer. One of his favorite things about this particular department was how organized his lab techs were. They made sure to digitize and share files as soon as they were processing the evidence. Sometimes in small towns, the labs could be behind on that sort of thing, sticking the detectives with hard copy paperwork that ended up coffee-stained or blown away in the wind. Here, looking through the present evidence was as easy as clicking a button. Not that that made the case any easier to solve. Cedric was starting to feel a headache creeping up on him. To his relief, the tab that displayed his email let out a chime, alerting him he had just received a new message. Cedric was grateful for the excuse to minimize the evidence files, even if just for a second while he deleted some junk message or rattled off a rapid response to some inane question or other. However, the name of the message's sender stopped him short. It was someone he had contacted in the research he'd been conducting while trying to track down Ash. He'd hit so many walls and dead ends he could scarcely believe he had finally received a reply. Eagerly, Cedric opened the message and skimmed it, eyes barely able to take it in. He read it again, more slowly this time. Part of him wanted to forward the message to Ember immediately. He even moved his cursor to the button, but he stopped himself before clicking. No, there was a right and a wrong way to do this. And he had long ago decided he wouldn't tell Ember about all of this until he was certain he could find her sister for her. He didn't want to get her hopes up and then fail to come through. Chapter 15. It was strange seeing George Tanner move through his murdered brother's house. George seemed nervous in it, like he hadn't quite adjusted to the fact that he owned it. Ember thought it must have also felt strange living and eating and sleeping in the same place where your brother was recently murdered. Someone must have aired the place out. The horrible smell was more or less gone by now, thank goodness. But even so, the thought must have been an unpleasant one. She couldn't help but wonder how close George had been to his brother, to choose to stay here rather than get a hotel room someplace. It wasn't as if he couldn't have afforded it. Did his insistence on staying here mean he and his brother had been close, or that they very much hadn't been? "Feel free to have a seat," George said, waving at a classy-looking armchair. "Would you like something to drink? We have, let's see, lemonade, I think, and soda. Water, of course, unless you like something stronger." "A soda would be great," Ember replied warmly. "Thank you so much." Carrying the to-go bag full of fresh shepherd's pie that Ember had pushed onto him, George disappeared into the kitchen. Ember didn't sit down just yet. Instead, she took the opportunity of George stepping out of the room to take a quick look around the place. When she'd been here before, she'd focused on the kinds of places in a house that usually yield clues. Computers and desks, which contained paperwork and files and correspondences that could give a sense of the last few days of a victim's life. Now that there was a potential suspect staying in the house, however, she wished she had a proper chance to check again. These few seconds would have to do. As quickly as she could, she scanned the room, checking behind furniture for anything out of place. Just as she heard George coming back from the kitchen, she caught sight of something odd underneath the large bookshelf in the corner of the room. She didn't get a great look at it, but she did see that it was cylindrical and glinted silver. A small can, perhaps? Of what? Whatever it was, it definitely didn't belong under that shelf. But she didn't have time to reach out and inspect it. Ember scurried to the armchair George had indicated earlier and sat down just in time for George to re-enter the room, holding 2 cans of soda. Sorry that took a while, George said. I was looking for where Matthew kept the glasses, but I couldn't find them. I'm still figuring out my way around here, to be honest with you. It's no trouble at all, Ember assured him. I prefer drinking from the can anyway. She cracked her can open and took a sip, as if to prove to him she was happy to do it. He did look a little heartened. Did you not spend much time here before? Ember asked. Before Matthew's death, she meant, but didn't have the heart to say. George clearly understood the question. He gave a sad smile. Not too much, no? Weren't you too close? He sipped his own soda, slowly and deliberately, as if to give himself a second to weigh his answer. Ember wondered if he was trying to gauge why she was interested. He was an out-of-towner, so he might not have heard of Ember's amateur sleuthing proclivities. She sort of hoped no one had let that slip to him just yet. If he didn't know about her unofficial relationship with this town's murder investigations, he might keep his guard down around her. Of course, the likelihood of someone not blabbing a detail like that to a newcomer in a town like Koshmar, slim to none. And from the way he was eyeing her, clearly turning his answer over in his head, she had a feeling that, nice guy or no, his guard was up. We've always gotten along, he said eventually. We would spend time together every once in a while, particularly after our parents died. George set down his soda can and fiddled anxiously with his cufflinks. I guess that means I'm all alone in the world now, he said in a heavy, deadened voice. Now that my brother is gone. Ember didn't have Kaylee's lie-detecting powers, but she didn't need them to know that George was genuinely distraught over his brother's death. Of course, that didn't mean he wasn't the murderer or hadn't been involved. No, people were more complicated than that. Ember and George chatted for a while. Mostly, they kept things light. George seemed politely curious about Koshmar, the pub, and so forth. They carefully skirted the topic of the murder, since George seemed more than happy ignoring it and Ember didn't want to seem overeager and push the grieving brother into icing her out. When he saw her out the door, he thanked her warmly for the shepherd's pie and the visit. She took the long way home on foot, to give herself a chance to mull everything she'd just learned over. It was time she started to think clearly about how George fit into this whole picture. Over the years, Ember had learned to trust her own intuition. Her magic wasn't uniquely powerful, but it was an inextricable part of who she was and how she experienced the world. And sometimes, if she could quiet her racing thoughts, she could get her magic to tell her things. Like how she felt about George Tanner. The largest impression she'd gotten off the man was that he seemed to be genuinely distraught about his brother's death. It was clear that, when he'd said he was alone in the world now, that wasn't a state he'd intentionally sought or desired. However, it was also undeniably true that he was the person with the most to gain from Matthew Tanner's death. All the world-renowned surgeon's wealth now belonged to George. Sure, George had been well off to begin with, but what wealthy person didn't innately seek more money, even in ruthless ways? And if his brother's death made him unhappy, well, maybe that was a consequence George had been willing to accept. After all, for some people, money did buy happiness. Chapter 16. Ember was taking advantage of a short break during the lunchtime rush to restock the fridge. She heard the door open and looked up. The man who entered was looking down. He was wearing a baseball cap, but she couldn't see his face until he stepped inside and raised his head. It was Lorne White, the man she met at the museum. He gave her a closed smile before walking over to the bar. "Hi," said Ember. "Lorne, isn't it?" "Yes, nice to see you again," he said. "What can I get you?" "Just a draft beer, please. Anyone is fine, and I may take a look at your menu." He picked up one of the menus off the bar. Ember grabbed a glass and placed it under the pump. "I don't think I've ever seen you in here before." Lauren looked up from perusing the menu. "I have been in a few times, before my wife." Ember felt a tug on her heart as she saw the intense grief flash across his face. She gave him a sympathetic smile and placed his beer on the bar. "I like it here, and your food is really good," he said as he picked up his glass and took a sip. "Thanks, it's good to know we're doing something right." My wife rather enjoyed your steak and onion sandwich, so I'll have one of those to take away if I may. Good choice, Ember said, making a note on her pad before taking it out to the kitchen. When she came back to the bar, Lorne was sitting on one of the stools and cleared his throat as she neared. I don't suppose you've figured out who the killer is yet? Ember stopped and turned to face him. Oh, I'm not quite sure how the police investigation is going. Have you found out anything yourself? Lorne asked as he took a pull on his pint, before raising his glass at her to indicate his approval. Me? Oh, I'm just a pub owner, not a detective. From what I've heard, you have more than helped in other investigations. Word is that you're the one who gets results. He eyed her inquisitively, waiting for a reaction. Ember took a step back and regarded the burly man before her, briefly wondering who he had been speaking to. I'm not sure who you've been talking to, but I assure you I tend to let the police do their job. Obviously, I'm happy to help them when and if I can, but they do an excellent job without me. Lorne raised his chin and smirked. I believe you aren't giving yourself enough credit. Ember didn't respond. Anyway, Lorne continued, I think it's a shame that someone was killed over a painting. I mean, I know it's a work of art and all that, but I don't get the whole paying millions for something that has no actual use. I just don't get it. He took another pull on his beer. Ember leaned her elbows on the bar and sighed. I agree. About it being a shame that someone was killed for a painting, I suppose some people can be very passionate about something that seems rather mundane to others. Lorne nodded in agreement as Ember excused herself and moved along the bar to serve one of her regulars. She looked back at Lorne as she placed a bottle of beer in front of her customer. Did you ever visit the museum? I think they do special exhibitions for local artists, which is always very popular. Lorne looked up in reflection. Me and the wife used to visit quite often. She used to be a bit of an artist herself back in the day, you know. Still have a few of her paintings on the wall in the bedroom. Ember took the money from her customer and moved back to where Lorne was sitting. I went with my friend Sage once and really enjoyed it. It's a shame I never really thought to go again. She loved the smell, she said. Lorne gave a slight shake of his head along with a pensive smile. The smell, Ember said, looking puzzled. I wasn't aware that a museum had any particular smell. I wasn't sure what she meant by that at the time, but I think it was the smell of turpentine in the art section. Oh yes, I suppose that could have been evident. Yeah, before they started cheaping out on turpentine, it used to smell like pine trees. I love that smell, said Ember. It reminds me of playing in the woods when I was a kid. Yeah, well, now they grind it all together and it smells like death. Ember wasn't sure how to respond. She gave him a tight smile before announcing, I'll just go and check on your sandwich. Annie was wrapping the sandwich in foil and brown paper as Ember entered the kitchen. She looked up at her. I could have brought it out to you. Ember held her hand up. No problem. It's for Lorne White. He's asking how the case is coming on. Annie handed her the wrapped sandwich. And what did you say? I told him that it's nothing to do with me. Annie giggled. Because heaven forbid you should poke your nose into an investigation. Ember gave her a friendly slap on the arm before taking the sandwich back out to Lorne. Lorne took the sandwich and downed the last of his beer. Thanks. Let's hope they catch who murdered the doc, he said. Sounds like a terrible way to go. Curse or no curse. True, she said with a sigh. But I'm sure Matthew would rather have not been killed either way. Lorne pursed his lips, tapped the bar twice with his palm, and then chuckled before finally heading out with his lunch. Chapter 17. The next chance she got, Ember left the broken broom in her staff's hands and went for a long walk to the museum. Brent Underwood was on shift, standing inside the museum near the front door. He was faced away when Ember approached, staring into the recesses of the museum. He jumped skittishly when he heard her footsteps and wheeled to look at her. Sorry, he said, sheepish. Guess I'm a little jumpy these days. I just about decked poor James when he came up behind me earlier. Ember held up both hands, smiling. Friend, not foe, she assured him. And they both chuckled, though Brent still seemed uneasy. The place is busy, huh? Ember asked. She couldn't see many patrons from where they were standing near the door, but she heard the sounds of many voices coming from rooms further in. Like I've never seen, Brent agreed. They all come for that horrible cursed painting, but then, well, some of them linger around longer, learn a thing or two. So I guess if there's a silver lining to all this... Sorry. Ember didn't want to point out that Brent probably shouldn't be looking for the silver lining in a death he was suspected of causing. Besides, Ember had a feeling the real silver lining for Brent was something a little closer to home. Well, he said, casting a wary look at Ember, what's on your mind? I know you're not here just to check on our daily patron numbers. Ember shook her head. I was wondering if you could walk me through who might have been able to get into this museum. I figured no one would know the ins and outs of this place. Literally, quite like you do. Brent considered the question a moment. Under normal circumstances, I'd have said you'd need a key. How about abnormal circumstances? Ember prompted. Brent shrugged. There are rumors, nothing I've ever found, so I'm not sure you can put much stock in them. Humor me. Tunnels. Brent pointed downward right at the tile under their feet. Supposedly they can be accessed from outside somewhere. And like I said, I've never seen them, but I guess I've heard things, sort of echoing noises and all that. And there's an entry point into the museum from the tunnels? Ember asked. Brent shrugged again. That's what they say. So Ember wondered who they referred to, but she didn't ask. So who would know about these tunnels? Well, I imagine they must be in the official planes, Brent said. Blueprints, that sort of thing. So my guess is anyone who had the blueprints could have potentially gotten in. Well, hello, Miss McNair. The voice startled both Brent and Ember, and they jumped and turned in unison. James Connor stood in the doorway, looking distinctly nervous. He was chewing his lip and darting his gaze between Ember and Brent suspiciously. Hi, Jameis, Ember said. I was just stopping by to chat with Brent. Oh, I heard you chatting, James replied superciliously. And I must say you are quite the shameless one, aren't you? Ember set her jaw stubbornly and crossed her arms over her chest. I'm afraid I don't know what you mean. James moved closer, seething with irritation. We both know you're smarter than that, he said, the slight stammer belying the fear underneath. You should leave poor Brent alone. Hasn't he been through enough already? Brent looked back and forth between James and Ember nervously. If you really think that way, then you and I are on the same page, Ember insisted. I'm trying to help him, because I happen to think he's innocent. It's true, James, Brent said. Ember's been real nice to me through all this. James hesitated. He looked like he had something he wanted to say, but he was holding it back. Since you weren't in the museum the night of the robbery, Ember said, her voice a challenge, I'm trying to figure out who else might have gotten in. And how? James watched her for a long, quiet moment, a baleful expression on his face. Then, without saying another word, he turned and left. Long after she'd lost sight of him, Ember could hear the shuffle of his worn-soled shoes echoing off into some unseen corner of the museum. Later that afternoon, Ember was back at the Broken Broom, helping out in the kitchen to prep for the dinner rush. She enjoyed the monotonous, methodical motions of the prep table, rinsing and dicing and mixing. She was grateful for the chance to lose herself in the minute physical operations of her business, which always helped her focus her mind when it was in a confused whirl. She was brought out of it by the sound of her phone ringing, the sensation of it buzzing in her pocket. Be right back, she called to the others in her kitchen as she skittered back into her office and closed the door. It was Cedric's name flashing on her screen. She was grinning by the time she answered. Hello? Well, Cedric said in greeting. You were right. She heaved a romantic sigh. Are there any more beautiful words on the planet? Cedric chuckled. Testing confirms your hunch about Brent. Which hunch is this? About the attack the night of the theft, Cedric elaborated. Based on where Brent was hit and the force applied, there doesn't seem to have been any way he could have committed the crime. It just wouldn't be possible to apply that kind of force against himself and at the angle and then still manage to hide the implement he used to do it. Ember pumped her fist in the air in victory. Unless, Cedric said, and Ember felt her sense of celebration diminish. He had help? She guessed. He's not quite out of consideration as an accomplice to the theft, Cedric confirmed. And the murder? Well, we're still looking into that. But it didn't go down the way people are saying. That much seems clear now. And, considering the extent of his injuries, is it really likely that an accomplice did it? Ember said, shuddering. With friends like that? Not likely, no, Cedric said. But not impossible. It's probably best if you still don't get too chummy with Brent. So Ember thought of the frightened, skittish man she'd left in the museum just an hour ago. Cedric was right, of course. Brent wasn't off the hook yet. She had to force herself to remember that. Chapter 18. Right as Ember got off the phone with Cedric, she heard a tapping at her office window. There, right on the other side of the glass, was a bat, perched and frantically flapping one wing against the pane as if knocking to get in. Ember crossed to the window and slid it open. The bat flew inside, circled the room once, twice, 3 times, and then suddenly surged outward in shape. Within a second, it grew from small and dark, stretching long and thin and growing dark, sleek hair. In the wake of the transformation, Sage stood in front of Ember. She smiled at her broadly. I was hoping you'd be in here, she said. I hate flying in the front when the waitresses are still around. Last time, Maggie came after me with a broom before I could fly into the bathroom and shift. Why don't you just walk here? Ember asked. Sage shrugged and plopped down at Ember's desk chair, then started rummaging in Ember's desk drawers for her stash of candy. Flying's faster. She unwrapped a mini chocolate bar and popped it in her mouth. What's up? Ember asked, perching at the side of the desk. Is this just a social call? Sage blinked at Ember in faux innocence. What else would it be? Ember crossed her arms and smirked. It could be you digging for gossip about the case. Flashing an exaggerated pout, Sage said, or I could be offering my valuable services to help you think through all the information you have. Besides, she added as if an afterthought, I might have some information for you. Spill. Could be nothing, Sage said with a shrug. But I overheard some people chatting about James Connor. Evidently, before all this started, it was looking like he might have to close the museum. No one ever came, no money coming in, all that. Ember raised an eyebrow. But now people are there all the time, Ember said. I was there earlier. They said the museum was doing a great business. Sage nodded significantly. I guess a cursed painting and a mysterious murder will do that for you, The best PR there is. Then again, we also are well aware of the fact that sometimes murders and curses can be bad for business, Ember remarked dryly. Oh, like you mean when people thought you were a murderer and they stopped coming by here? Sage offered. Or how about when they thought Luca was a killer and they turned against Fairy Tales Inn? I hope they start to suspect Lila soon, Sage muttered. Then maybe there'll still be some of those cinnamon rolls left by the time I make it to her shop in the morning. Ember chuckled. Lila Delacroix, the grumpy old fairy who ran the Sweet Things bakery nearby, really did have a magic touch with those cinnamon rolls. But Ember wasn't sure she'd go so far as to wish public censure on the woman just to get her hands on one. So if James is responsible for all this, then we're saying he calculated that the curse and the murder might help keep the doors open, Ember mused. But how could he have known for sure that the result would increase traffic to the museum? Maybe he didn't know, Sage suggested. He could have committed the murder for some other reason, and then it was just an added bonus that new visitors started pouring in. She popped another mini chocolate bar into her mouth and muttered wisely around it. Correlation does not equal causation. Just then, Maggie knocked on the office door and opened it. She was holding a broom, and Sage flinched at the sight of it. Maggie looked at Sage, curious, then turned to Ember. Just finished sweeping up in the dining area. We should be all ready for the dinner crowd once we get these salads prepped. I'll be right out, Ember told her, still chuckling to herself at the wary glance Sage was keeping leveled on the offending broom. All through the dinner shift, Ember's thoughts strayed to James. If he didn't think that new visitors would come to the museum, what would his motive for the murders be? He needed money. That much was clear. But he hadn't sold the painting. At least not right away. The painting had ended up at Matthew's house with a dead Matthew. No one would sell a stolen item like that to someone in the same town, would they? That would take an especially dumb criminal. Or maybe a very desperate one. Excuse me? Ember jerked out of her reverie. She realized she'd been wiping down the same glass behind the bar for what must have been minutes. The customer trying to flag her attention was wearing a patient, bemused look on her face. "I'm so sorry about that," Ember said brightly as she could manage. "What can I get you?" As she mixed up the customer's drink, however, she felt her thoughts go back to Matthew. If he really had bought a stolen painting, then what did that say about him? She still didn't know as much about him as she'd like. Often enough, understanding a person's murder was as simple as understanding the person himself, what his life had been like leading up to the tragic event. But Matthew she still mostly knew through reputation alone. That was solid enough anyway. He had a great standing in the medical community, as well as in Cauchemar at large. He certainly would have heard about the painting's theft along with everyone else. Would he really have bought it, knowing it was stolen? Somehow Ember didn't think that was likely. "You done with that?" Once again, the customer was watching her zone out. This time, Ember was whipping the cocktail shaker around with mindless vehemence. Ember laughed sheepishly and poured the cocktail into a glass. "Well shaken," she assured herself consciously, and she was glad to get a laugh. But try as she might to focus on her work, the case loomed up out of every mental silence, waiting for her, nagging at her, poking holes in all her theories. Where was she supposed to turn next? Chapter 19. Armed with the new information she'd gotten from Sage, Ember decided to circle back to the museum again when she had the chance. She entered as quietly as she could. Brent was no longer standing near the door, so the vestibule was empty. But she could hear the sound of two men's voices chatting just inside the museum, near the admissions desk. "Quite a number of people," James was saying, sounding pleased. "I lost count, to be honest." "The official count is around here somewhere," Brent answered him. "It's a doozy. I've never seen numbers like this, not since I started here." "And all of this for a curse," James said with a chuckle. "Now all we need are a couple of ghosts to haunt the museum, and we'll become a complete success." Ember wondered what these men would think about the fact that their museum often was haunted by an ancient Native American ghost. Not that she was about to tell them that, of course. "And Black Sea still hasn't even been replaced yet," James continued. "People are paying just to come in and look at where it used to hang. Imagine how much better it will be when the painting is returned to the wall. We'll have a line out the door." "We'll have to double the entrance price," Brent said. "It's all working out so well," James responded. His voice was practically brimming over with pleasure, but it wasn't clear what had gotten him so happy. Was it really just the improved numbers at the museum? Or was there something else? It hadn't seriously occurred to Ember until now to think about the possibility that James and Brent could have been working together to pull off the theft, and even possibly the murder. They both had motives. They had worked together at the museum for a long time, and they clearly knew each other well. If James had known that Brent was willing to do anything to get Victoria back, maybe he had been the one to approach Brent with the plan. Or if Brent had known about James and his desperation to get the museum up and running again, he could have been the one to float the idea. Ember slipped out of the museum doors, still mercifully unseen. As she walked back toward the broken broom, she turned both scenarios around in her mind. She wasn't sure which seemed likelier, but in either case, it would mean that Brent was awfully chummy with the person who had almost killed him. If James had caused the injury as a ruse to stage the theft, had he intended to hit Brent so hard he was hospitalized for days? Or had it been an accident, a miscalculation, a momentary loss of control? When she made it back to the broken broom, she went back to her office for a while to think. Why don't you talk about it? Kaylee asked her, uncurling luxuriously from where she lay on top of a stack of papers. Talk about what? Ember rubbed at her nose nervously. The skin prickled with sensitivity, telling her this wasn't the first time she'd rubbed that spot recently. Funny, she hadn't noticed doing it. The case, Kaylee said. Whatever new theories got your mind in knots. So Ember filled Kaylee in on her conversation with Brent earlier in the day, then what Sage had told her. Finally, she told Kaylee about what she'd overheard between Brent and James just minutes ago, then did her best to summarize the swirling thoughts she'd been unable to push away during her walk back to the pub. Kaylee said when Ember was done. I can see what you mean. The whole thing would make more sense if they'd been working together. But do you really think that's what happened? I don't know, Ember confessed. And there's one missing piece that even this theory doesn't take into consideration. Which is? Kaylee prompted. Yeah. None of this explains what Matthew's interest in the painting means, Ember said. From what I found at his house, he clearly was interested. If he wanted to own it, he could have just bought it. He was a successful doctor with money to spare, Kaylee agreed. By all accounts. So I guess it would be explained if Matthew was the one who had stolen the painting, Ember said. And he might even have schemed with Brent to do it. But if Matthew was the thief and involved someone else in his scheme, why Brent of all people? He'd stolen the guy's wife. He must have known Brent hated him. Wait, Kaylee said, not sure where this was going anymore. Matthew and Brent? Ember barely noticed. Even if James and Brent were working together, Matthew clearly let his killer into his house. Would he have let Brent in? I don't think so. James, maybe. And then the two might have rushed and overpowered him together. Questionable, Kaylee said, considering at that time Brent had a pretty nasty head injury. Ember huffed heavily and gave Kaylee an exhausted loo. I can't think straight. Nothing is coming together. I think I'm going to take a nap. Would you mind keeping an eye out and waking me up if anyone's coming? She switched the office lights out and curled up under her desk. It was hard and cramped down there, but she was so tired she managed to fall asleep almost as soon as he had stilled. The dream was right there, waiting for her as she sank out of consciousness. She found herself in a dark pitching world. Salt air filled her nostrils, and all around were the sounds of roaring wind and crying gulls. And water. Lapping, licking, seething, frothing water. Ember was a buoy, bobbing among the waves. Not bobbing high enough. Each cresting wave raised her and crashed around her all at once, smacked her face like a sharp blast and filled her nostrils and throat with its icy, brackish taste. Help! She called, but she made no sound. Help me! She was drowning, sinking deeper in this wet black brine. There was no one around. Except that then there were hands, reaching out and gripping her shoulder. She felt a surge of relief, knowing she was about to be pulled up and out of the water. But no. The hands were pressing down, pushing her into the deep. The water rose and closed above her, sealed itself over her nose and mouth and eyes, and this was it. This was the end of it. Something heavy and hard hit Ember in the chest. She woke up sputtering, like she was coughing up water, but she was dry. Kaylee was sitting on her sternum, giving her a frightened look. Maybe it's best you stay awake for the time being, she suggested. Throat sore, holding back another cough, Ember nodded in unhesitating agreement. Chapter 20. News? Ember asked as Cedric approached the bar. He gave her a tired smile and sat in his usual stool. What, you think I'm not just swinging by to say hi? Ember cocked an eyebrow. I like to think I can read you a little better than that, Sheriff. He scoffed, then relented. All right, he said, conceding. News. Me did a little analysis, compared it with notes from Brent's hospital stay. Looks like both Brent and Matthew were hit in the head with the same kind of heavy, blunt instrument. That is news, Ember said, taking the information in. Any idea what that instrument was? Cedric shrugged. Best guess is a wrench or a bat. Can't tell specifics just yet and won't know for sure unless we find it. If it's a wrench or a bat, then those are pretty common, Ember said. Anyone might have one of those. So we're hoping we'll track down our guy through some other means, Cedric agreed. Find the implement once we have a warrant. That's if the implement hasn't been thrown into the bayou already. Hey, bayou gigging for murder weapons is one of the perks of the job, Cedric said dryly. Brent used to work for the sheriff's department, Ember mused. Would he still have his police baton? Cedric gave Ember a curious look. I'm not sure. That's probably something we'd have on file whether he returned it or not. But Ember had already moved on to another thought. What about a heavy can of something? She asked, thinking back to that glint she'd seen beneath the bookcase at Matthew's house. There's one at the doctor's place that we might have missed. Hidden in there. You really think someone would have been stupid enough to leave the murder weapon in the same location? Cedric asked, dubious. Ember shrugged. It would be very purloined letter. Hidden in plain sight, you know. Cedric considered. It didn't seem likely to him, but he knew better than to second-guess Ember's instincts at this point. He shrugged again. I can stop by when I get a chance. She smiled gratefully at him. Time was, she would have had to explain her reasoning more carefully, would have been put in a position where she had to push back at a stubborn Cedric who was digging his heels in. But now he was getting to trust her more and more, and they were getting to be good partners in more ways than one. The thought warmed her heart, and by the time Cedric left her with a kiss, she was feeling much less shaken by her earlier nightmare. Once Cedric left, Ember tried her best to keep busy with work around the pub. But it was a weeknight, and the dinner rush was mostly over. People were headed home rather than staying out over drinks. When the work dried up, Ember's thoughts drifted inevitably back to the case. Truth be told, she agreed with Cedric that it was unlikely the killer was stupid enough to leave the murder weapon simply lying around the scene of the crime. But then again, she reasoned, people have been known to do very stupid things, like rob banks with hold-up notes written on the back of their own deposit slip. Especially if the crime was spontaneous, maybe the killer had messed up and hastily stashed the weapon, then not managed to get access to dispose of it later on when they'd cooled down and started thinking straight again. Or even if the crime was planned, that took a lot of adrenaline, what had happened to Dr. Tanner. Maybe the killer's entire body was coursing with the sheer energy of it, all their nerves firing away from their brain and into their dumb animal instincts, fight and freeze and flight. Not long later, Cedric called. George was happy enough to give me permission, he told her. I went in, looked around, but I didn't see anything. Okay, Ember said. Good to know. She thanked him and hung up, still unconvinced. Just because Cedric didn't find the weapon didn't mean it wasn't there. Not that she doubted his professional acuity. On the contrary, Cedric was by nature a sharply observant person, and his wolf senses only greatly enhanced his ability to sniff out clues. But he was also the consummate professional, and she couldn't help but imagine the scene as it had likely unfolded. Cedric's rap at the door, his good cop greeting, and oh-so-polite request to be given access to the house. Just a quick look around, that's all. So non-threatening George wouldn't have been able to turn him down without putting him on guard. And then Cedric would have wanted to stick to his word, to make everyone feel very polite and cursory, far from a violation. Nothing that would set George ill at ease. After all, if Cedric really wanted to take a look, he could always come back with a warrant. That possibility would be first and foremost in Cedric's mind. There was a right and a wrong way to locate vital evidence in a murder case, and the only right way was preceded by a probable cause and a judge's signature. So by the time Ember was closing up the broken broom, she had made a decision. If a real inspection of the doctor's house was going to happen, Ember would have to do it herself. Ember killed the lights as she drove up carefully and parked around the corner from Dr. Matthew Tanner's house. Either she was going to wait until George Tanner left, or until the lights went out in the house. She would prefer not to sneak around if he was asleep upstairs, but it was better than nothing. Luckily, she didn't have to wait long. Even more luckily, it looked like he had someplace to be. She watched as George left the house, climbed into his car, and drove off. Then, closing her eyes and visualizing the inside of Dr. Tanner's house, Ember disappeared. Chapter 21. Ember had already been inside Dr. Tanner's house a number of times, but there was something particularly eerie about it tonight. The great cavernous space loomed all around her, holding darkness in its corners. Darkness that reminded her of the lapping, gripping waves of her dreams. In the quiet, she almost imagined she could hear those same waves now, surging and pulling in her ears. But it was only the sound of her own agitated breaths, the thrum of her heart in her chest. The first place she checked was under the bookcase where she'd seen the can before. The area underneath the lowermost shelf was utter darkness, a black strip of fathomless abyss. She felt too nervous to reach her hand in to feel for the can, and neither did she want to flick on a light. The huge windows facing out onto the street were blocked only by gauzy curtains, and switching on a light bulb would have blared her presence to the neighborhood. Instead, crouching low and peering along the carpet, Ember breathed deep and pulled a spark of magic from her chest. She felt it swell, warm and welcoming, cresting within her. Then, she whispered the spell that would manifest it into a tiny glimmer of light along her fingertips. The gleam faintly brightened the space beneath the shelf, enough for Ember to make out that it was empty. The can was gone. I don't understand, Ember thought, feeling a fleeting sensation of panic. I didn't even think George knew it was here. Unless, of course, George had a not-so-innocent reason for knowing the can was under the shelf, and for moving it from that location. Maybe following an exploratory visit from a certain local sheriff. Even so, if George had wanted to hide the can, he probably would have known better than to simply throw it out in the trash. If he thought the police were surveilling him, surely he'd know that was the easiest way of getting caught. So either George had disposed of the can in a more elaborate way, was perhaps out doing so right at that very moment, or else the can was someplace here in this house. In any case, Ember knew she needed to keep moving, keep looking around. As methodically as she could, Ember continued to pick her way through the empty house, keeping her magic glow low enough not to attract attention, but light enough for her to see by. She didn't want to risk bumping into anything and breaking it, leaving evidence of her snooping. That wasn't something she felt it wise to repeat. She made her way into the master bedroom. It seemed as though George had taken up sleeping in here, evidently untroubled by the fact that it had been the domain of his murdered brother. Well, the house did belong to him now. Perhaps there was nothing suspicious about it. However, no sooner had she entered the room than she heard the front door open and close. Freezing in place, allowing her light to blink out, Ember lingered in the doorway. George was talking loudly, carrying on one half of a conversation. She couldn't hear who he was talking with, so he must have been on the phone. Yes, absolutely, George was saying excitedly. As I'm sure you can imagine, I'm feeling very impatient about it all, as I'm sure you must be too, James. James? Ember mouthed the name to herself. Could George really be talking to the museum curator? Only a matter of time, George said, making his way through the house. Yes, I know. We'll have to be patient. With a start, Ember realized that George's footsteps were drawing closer to where she was standing just inside the bedroom doorway. As much as she wanted to linger a few seconds longer to see if she could discover what George and James were discussing, she figured that now would be the best time to make her speedy exit. She allowed the spell to move through her, and within a second she was standing by her car, parked around the corner, staring at the now illuminated window that peered into Dr. Tanner's bedroom. All the way home, Ember tried to figure out what George and James could possibly have to talk about. She had first met George at the museum, sure, but he had hardly seemed like an art connoisseur, not like his brother was. In fact, he hardly seemed interested in art at all. Not to mention, George had just as much reason as Ember herself did to suspect that James might have been involved in murdering his brother. By the time she made it home and trudged up to her apartment, she was starting to feel a headache coming on. Kaylee's first reaction on seeing Ember come through the door was to shoot her a curious look, but she shelved her questions when she noticed how confused her witch looked. "Let's get you some chamomile," said Kaylee, circling Ember's ankles in an attempt to herd her into the kitchen and over toward the kettle. "Then you have to spill. Details, not the tea." Ember did as directed, glad to be mothered a little. By the time the tea was brewed, Ember had brought Kaylee up to speed on all she'd overheard, and the swirling thoughts that snippet of conversation had left in her mind. "So what does that prove?" Kaylee mused. She was staring intently at the wall, like the look she got when there was a fat, juicy beetle crawling around. But when Ember looked, there wasn't anything there. "Does it make George seem guilty?" Ember shrugged. "It might make him seem guilty," she echoed, "but it proves absolutely nothing. And another thing that points to his innocence, he had absolutely 0 scratches on him. Also, he wasn't even in town when his brother was killed. I mean, that we know of." "That doesn't mean he wasn't nearby enough to have done it," Kaylee said. "No," Ember conceded. "Still, all of this, it's frustrating. I feel like I've been working so hard on this case, and I'm still no closer to proving Brent's innocence." Or his guilt, they both thought, but didn't say. Chapter 22. The next morning, Ember was just getting ready for the day when someone knocked at her apartment door. She gave Kaylee a nervous look. "I haven't even showered yet." Kaylee shrugged. "You could bathe in front of them. I do it all the time." Ember snorted. She looked at the door again warily. When another knock rang out, she threw up her hands. "If they can drop by this early, they can stand to see me unshowered." It was Sage and Luca standing at the door. "Hey," Sage said in greeting. "Are you going?" Ember looked down at herself in her rumpled PJs and slippers. "Going?" "Not now," Sage said. "This evening." "To Matthew Tanner's wake," Luca explained. "Oh," Ember said, somber. "I hadn't realized that was today." Her 2 friends came in and sat on her couch. "We weren't sure if you were going to go or not," Luca said. "We're planning to. I mean, not like we knew him super well, but it's just sad what happened to him, isn't it? I can't help feeling sad about it." Ember lowered herself gingerly into the armchair where Kaylee was curled up, nudging her familiar to the side. They ended up splitting the seat half and half, with Kaylee luxuriously spread out and Ember scrunched tightly along the edge. "After the wake, there's going to be a midnight walk along Matthew's favorite river trail," Sage said. "And then we're all going to put tea candles afloat in the river." "That sounds wow," Ember said, not sure what else to say. "So?" Luca prompted. "You want to come along with us?" "I don't know about that," Ember said carefully. "It seems like it could be dangerous. An unsolved murder like this? Aren't the murderers usually drawn to events like that?" "That sounds like a television fact," Sage said. "Television facts come from someplace," Ember countered. "Anyway, a walk around in the dark? I just hope you two keep in mind that Matthew was ambushed from behind and hit over the head. Keep an eye out for each other." Everyone in town seemed to know Ember was looking into this case. And everyone in town knew that Sage and Luca were her friends. It wouldn't be the first time someone she loved was attacked because of Ember's investigations. "We can't just hide from the world," Luca said. Sage, however, was giving Ember that canny look she often got when there was something Ember felt but didn't say. Sometimes Ember thought Sage could see right into her and know all her unspoken thoughts and feelings. In a gentle voice, Sage said, "I know you love us like sisters. We love you too. Please don't worry. We're going to be just fine." Ember smiled, somewhat heartened by Sage's encouragement. Then suddenly, Sage's gentle face turned almost wicked with mischief. "You know, if you had children to worry about, you wouldn't cluck so much over your friends," she remarked in a faux thoughtful voice. Luca giggled. "She's right," she said delightedly. "Stop being such a mother hen." Ember grinned and rolled her eyes. "Oh, stop. Really." "Honestly," Sage said, more serious now, We'll be surrounded by other people. Half of Kakamar is probably going to be there tonight. Really, don't worry. And we'll keep our eyes out for clues, Luca promised warmly. And our ears, Sage said. Ember felt grateful to both of them. She couldn't quite pack away her feeling of worry, but she trusted her friends. They were both smart, savvy, and magical to boot. If they were on their guard, they would probably be just fine. When Luca and Sage had gone, Ember finished getting ready, then traipsed down into the pub to start opening it for the day. In the meantime, she turned over all her theories in her mind. She had 3 suspects: Brent Underwood, James Connor, and George Tanner. She hadn't really discovered anything definitive yet, in one direction or the other, on any of these suspects. On paper, she ought to be considering the odds of their potential involvement just about equally. But this wasn't a case on paper. This was a real dead man, murdered in a particularly brutal way. And Ember's instincts were screaming at her. Cases like this had a tendency to make her second-guess her impulses, to twist her around until she felt she couldn't be sure of anything. But in these quiet moments, her intuition returned to her, and she couldn't ignore the face that she was leaning in a certain direction. The only one of her 3 suspects she really thought was capable of the crime was James. He had motive, opportunity, and means. That said, leaving the painting after murdering Matthew didn't make much sense. Not unless he had been in on the whole thing with Brent, and Ember really didn't believe that Brent had anything to do with it. But now, from what she'd overheard last night, it seemed entirely possible that James and George were in on the whole thing together. To what end? James wanted the fame. He wanted an influx of attention, interest, and money to revitalize his struggling museum. And George wanted... what? Money? His brother's wealth and his family's inheritance all to himself? Was George the kind of person to kill for such a superficial reason? It appeared to Ember that he already had plenty. But then again, she knew there were those who would never be satisfied with the wealth they had, would become ruthless in the pursuit of more even if they had no need for it. Was there some other reason too? Something else that had pushed either of the 2 men over the edge and into murder? How deep did this go? These thoughts kept her busy all day long. By the time she went to bed that night, she had tied herself into a worried knot. Most of all, she was worried for Brent. Not only was he being abused at the town's hands, but also it couldn't be ignored that, if he was innocent, he posed a serious threat to the real killer. Someone had already tried to kill Brent and failed. Was it possible they would try again? Chapter 23. By the end of a very busy evening in the pub, Ember was glad to sit on her sofa with a much-needed glass of wine, some leftover fish pie from the kitchen, and Kaylee purring sleepily as she nuzzled into her thigh. She didn't watch much television, but she secretly enjoyed Buffy the Vampire Slayer. The whole 7 series were being replayed, and she was determined to watch at least 3 episodes before going to bed. Episode 2 was about to conclude when Ember heard a clattering sound coming from downstairs in the pub. It was loud and sounded like someone had crashed into the rack of hanging pots and pans. She grabbed the remote, muted the sound on the TV, and listened again. Her brow furrowed in concentration as she carefully placed her food tray on the coffee table. There it was again. Another crashing sound, although not quite as loud. It was definitely in the bar, or, more likely, the kitchen. Mentally confirming that all the staff had left after closing, Ember gave Kaylee a nudge. Kaylee stirred but didn't wake. Ember nudged her a little harder. "Kaylee!" Her voice was low but determined. Kaylee opened her eyes and yawned. She pushed both paws into the air and flipped her tail. She looked up at Ember. "I was having a lovely dream. I was about to catch a mouse. Why did you wake me?" Ember stood. "Listen," she whispered. "There's someone downstairs." Kaylee moved swiftly onto all fours and crept over to the doorway. There was another sound of clanking metal. "Maybe you should call Cedric." Ember looked at her and nodded. "I'll take my phone with me." She grabbed her cell phone off the table and began making her way quietly down the hallway to the stairs, skillfully moving from place to place in a random pattern. Kaylee followed ninja style, leaping from one piece of furniture to the next before asking, "Why are you meandering all over the place?" Just as she said it, she leapt down off a small hall table and the floorboard gave a loud creak. Ember sighed and raised her eyebrows. "That was why." "Oh," said Kaylee with a cough. "Sorry about that." Ember shook her head and activated the flashlight on her phone as the landing light diminished. She made her way to the top of the stairs. Kaylee rubbed against her calf. "What are you doing?" Ember said, looking down at her. "When I suggested you call Cedric, I meant now." "I'll just check first. One of the staff might have forgotten something." Kaylee shook her head. "He will win who knows when to fight and when not to fight." "Sun Tzu?" asked Ember. Kaylee nodded. That dude had an appropriate quote for every occasion. Ember sniggered before moving down the stairs into the bar. She couldn't see anything, and the noise had stopped. Slowly, Ember and Kaylee made their way towards her office and saw that the door was ajar. Ember glanced down at Kaylee before pushing it lightly with her fingertips. The ambient light from an outside street lamp highlighted the flash of metal, which came hurtling across the room towards her head. The frying pan caught her on the back of the head, but just barely. At the last second, Talako had appeared and pushed her out of the way. They all watched, frozen, as the dark figure ran out of the office. Ember held her hand to the back of her head to check for blood. There was a small amount, but nothing to worry about. She held her other hand out towards Talako. "I don't know how you managed that, but thank you." Talako's usual stern look had been traded for one of concern. "You may want to get that looked at." "I'll be fine," Ember replied with a grateful smile. She rallied herself and tried following the figure. Whoever it was had run towards the kitchen. When Ember reached the kitchen, she found Kaylee panting by the back door. "Sorry, Ember, I couldn't catch him." Ember gave her a pat on the head and took out her phone. "Okay, now I need to ring Cedric." Cedric arrived armed with an attitude and a full forensic team. "What the hell were you thinking?" His green eyes flashed with incredulity. Ember dropped her head. "I suppose it was a bit silly of me to check it out without calling you first." "Silly?" he growled. "Ember, it was downright irresponsible. If you want to keep helping out with investigations, you're going to have to rein in the bravery a touch." Ember smiled a greeting at one of the tech guys as he made his way to her office. She waited until he was out of earshot before speaking. "I was going to call you, that's why I took my phone." She turned to Kaylee. "Wasn't I Kaylee?" Kaylee took a step back in disbelief. "Seriously?" Cedric looked at them both and sighed. "I want to put a guard on you. You're not safe here. I'll get 2 of my men to stay with you." "Is that really necessary?" she asked as she dropped her shoulders. Cedric lifted her chin gently and gazed into her eyes. "I couldn't bear it if anything happened to you." Ember felt the warmth of his skin and wanted to collapse into his strong arms and cry. Instead, she gave him a warm smile, touched his chest with her palm, and told him, "I don't need your officers to guard me. I have my own protection." She looked across where Talako was hiding out of sight near the fireplace and walked over. She held her arms out to him, and for the first time ever, this quiet giant had mass enough for her to hug. Ember held on to Talako for a long time before stepping back, looking at his form and asking, "How is that possible?" Talako shrugged his well-rounded shoulders. "It's a thing." Chapter 25. Ember woke up the next morning feeling unusually alert. She saw the notes about the case that she left on her nightstand when she went to bed the previous evening. She turned the conversation she had with Cedric, Talako, Sage, and Kaylee over in her head. Everyone seemed pretty convinced that James, or at least the museum, was involved. That also left Brent as a major suspect, even with his injuries. But there was still so much to learn about George. Could he really be capable of killing his brother to add to his already vast fortune? Ember jumped out of bed and began to get ready to leave. Kaylee chased after her, right on her heels. Ember needed to find out if George had killed his brother and eliminate him as a suspect, or have him taken into police custody. Ember arrived at the late Dr. Tanner's house. Kaylee dutifully walked up the pathway to the front door next to Ember. Ember knocked on the door. She knew that she had to get answers. George opened the door. He looked surprised to see her. "Ember, what brings you here?" he asked. "I need to speak to you about some things regarding your brother's death," Ember said. Her tone was polite, but she needed answers. He raised an eyebrow. "What do you need to know?" She took a deep breath. It was now or never. "Did you have anything to do with Matthew's death?" George's jaw dropped. "Did I have anything to do with Matthew's death?" he repeated. "Of course not. What on earth would make you suspect such a thing?" "You do stand to gain quite a bit of money from his death," Ember explained. "People have done terrible things for money in the past." He shook his head. "I loved my brother. No amount of money would ever make me do anything to hurt him. Besides, I have plenty of money. I'd much rather have my brother than have his estate." "Is there anyone who can confirm your whereabouts that night?" "Yes, there is," he said. "I was at a bachelor party for my best friend. Everyone there can confirm my whereabouts. I can give you his number." "That would be nice, thank you." George moved back inside to grab a paper and pen. Ember made a mental note to check the alibi. Kaylee meowed up at Ember. She thought that George may be telling the truth. Ember thought he seemed truthful as well. He returned and handed her a piece of paper with a name and phone number written on it. "I hope this will be alibi enough." His tone was noticeably cold. "Yes, I'm sure it will. I'll follow up as soon as possible." "Well, if there's anything else you'd like to accuse me of, I could likely provide alibis for those crimes as well." "I have to work to eliminate all the suspects," Ember said. "I didn't mean to offend you." "It's fine," he said, though it clearly wasn't. "Have you considered that guard from the museum, Brent? It seems likely that he would have a motive too. They've been profiting quite a bit from all of this." "That is true, but it would have been impossible for him to hit himself in the back of the head that hard," she said. "His injuries were real and could have caused permanent damage." "I guess then he's a pretty unlikely suspect." "Did you know anyone who would want to hurt your brother?" she asked. "Did he have any enemies?" George shook his head. "Everyone loved Matthew. He helped out people all the time and donated to charities. He even bought houses for Habitat for Humanity. He literally saved people's lives on and off the job." "He seems like he was a wonderful person," she said. "He was. That's why it's unbelievable that someone would murder him." "Then I think it brings up the question of if he was the true target." "What do you mean?" George asked. "Well, was someone after your brother, Brent, or the painting?" she wondered. "The painting may be the biggest mystery of all." "Yeah, I guess so," he said. "All of this trouble and harm for a painting." "I think once we figure out the answer, we'll be closer to finding the killer. I know you weren't here when he died, but if you saw anything or noticed any evidence, please let me know." He nodded. "I'll think about it. Maybe there's something I missed." "All right. Thanks for your time," she said. "Yes. If there's a break in the case, please let me know," he said, closing the door. Ember started walking back to the car. Kaylee walked beside her. "Well, that could have gone better," Kaylee said. "We got the answers we need," Ember said. "I'm going to check this alibi as soon as I can. Hopefully I didn't make an enemy in the process. I think anyone would be upset that someone thought they were capable of killing their sibling," she said. "But you did the right thing. I'm sure he'll see that in time too." "I just need to solve this case. I feel like I can't rest until I do." "At least you eliminated someone. That's encouraging, right?" "I guess so," Ember said. She didn't feel very encouraged. "Don't sound so glum," Kaylee said. "It's like you said. One suspect eliminated makes you that much closer to finding the real killer. There's still James." "Right. There's still James." Ember and Kaylee walked back to her car and got in. Ember thought about James's and Brent's potential involvement in the murder. Surely there were easier ways to drive up museum ticket sales. Ember still didn't know the real target of the crime, and she still didn't know what the saintly doctor was doing with the painting. She put the key in the ignition and started to drive. She felt time continuing to slip away. Something bad was about to happen. She could practically feel it. Danger was around every corner, and it was only a matter of time before the killer would try to strike again. Chapter 26. Ember called George's best friend. He was able to confirm his alibi. He even offered the names of others as well who could further verify George's story. Ember declined. She already knew George was innocent. Confirming his alibi was all she needed to fully eliminate him from her suspect pool. Ember went back to the tavern and into her office. She took her case notes and crossed George off of her list. She felt like she was back to square one. Kaylee jumped up and sat on the desk. "So that leaves James and Brent," she said. "I don't want to brag, but I predicted this." "I still don't know," Ember said. "I don't think we've gotten enough evidence on those two to say for certain if they were involved." "What else do you need? The museum has been doing so well lately." "Right, but it's more than that. We still don't know why the doctor was murdered or how he got the painting." "They could have targeted him because of his relationship with Brent's wife," Kaylee suggested. "It certainly seems like he had reason to seek revenge." "I'll admit he has a motive, but it still doesn't explain how he ended up bludgeoned." "Easy," Kaylee said. "James is in on it too." Ember was doubtful. Though the scenario was technically possible, it seemed like there were much easier ways to enact their plan to murder Matthew. Why would they choose such a risky option, though? Ember wondered. This wasn't a minor injury. James and Brent would have to trust one another a lot to purposefully injure him like that. "I guess," Kaylee said, "but stranger things have happened." "I think it's unlikely that Brent being bludgeoned was part of the plan. In any case, I really don't think he seems like a murderer. He seems too gentle for that." "Then what about James? He could have been acting alone." "I suppose so. All of this did bring a fair amount of ticket sales to the museum." Kaylee flicked her tail. How clever. He could have made the plan when he heard about the curse. He set up a fake theft and some injuries to make it convincing. Everyone would be too distracted trying to see the evil painting to see that he was the murderer. Ember thought about this scenario. It did make sense on the surface. However, this too felt full of holes. That's a lot of trouble to go to just to bring people to the museum. People will do desperate things for money. That was the theory behind George's motivation as well. "That is true," Ember admitted, "but it's a much riskier plan. He would have had to hurt a friend of his." "To throw police off the trail," Kaylee interrupted. "Maybe, but then he would have to plant the painting in the doctor's house and then murder the doctor. Why Dr. Tanner? Why not take the painting back at the end of everything?" "Well, people would need to know that the painting was there. But the painting could have been held for evidence by the police." Kaylee thought to herself. "Didn't you say something about the painting being the target?" "Yes, that thought did cross my mind. I don't think Dr. Tanner stole it. Why would he? There's not many surgeons turned violent art thieves." "Right. Someone was moving the painting around," Kaylee said, nodding. "Someone had a reason to make sure that everyone around the painting got hurt." "And that does make James seem like the most likely suspect, but it doesn't fill in the holes in the story." "Then maybe there's some of the story we're missing." "I think that's true, but I'm not sure that what we're missing necessarily has to do with James." Ember tapped her pencil on the desk. There were so many questions swirling around her head. She kept coming back to the same pieces of evidence. The mystery of the painting was the most obvious. Moving the painting around didn't make a lot of sense for any of the suspects. Even for James, whose motivation fit the movements the most, it was a risky maneuver. However, as she had said before to George, people who need money will do plenty of things to get it, things that they might not do normally. Ember started to absent-mindedly sketch the painting as she thought. The painting was not in Matthew's favored art style, yet it had mysteriously come into his life right at the end of it. There's a lot that we don't know, Kaylee said. Her eyes followed Ember's pencil as she sketched. Yeah, I wish there was a way to find out more. Namely, how the painting fits into all of this. It seems pretty important for some old painting. Someone is willing to kill over it. But not enough to take it for themselves, Ember said, finishing the thought. That's the most confusing part. It makes you wonder why Brent was hurt, Kylie said, flopping onto her side. One person is almost killed and the painting goes missing. Then one person is killed and it's just right there. It sure is strange, Ember said. Once I figure that out, I think everyone else will fall into place. Kaylee rubbed her head against Ember's arm and started to purr. Ember felt calmed by her faithful cat's purrs, but she still felt herself obsessing over the case. It felt like it would never get solved. Though she was still feeling the familiar sense of dread of something terrible about to happen, she also felt a hopelessness creeping in. She wondered what would happen if she couldn't solve the case. Would someone else get hurt? Would the painting go missing again? Ember didn't have the answers, as much as she wished she did. For now, all she had was her notes, one suspect's name cleared, and plenty of questions. She let out a sigh. She needed to get some answers, and fast before this case completely stalled. Chapter 27. Unsure where else to go, Ember decided to do what came most naturally when she hit a dead end. Don't interrupt unless it's an emergency, all right? She asked Kaylee, who nodded. Kaylee had seen Ember prepare for meditation often enough to understand what the candles she was rummaging through the storage drawer for meant. When Ember was alone in her room, she lit the candles and sat cross-legged, straight-backed in the middle of her bed. She could still remember what it was like as a child, trying so desperately to focus her mind, not knowing that the act of trying was what was throwing her off. Ember had left those sessions feeling muddled and defeated. Somehow she had managed to learn the trick. She couldn't remember how, only the faint impression of someone telling her, "Let go of your desire." Those words had unlocked something vital in Ember. Ever since she'd first heard them, meditation felt like a tipping forward, a surrender into something larger than herself. What did she desire now? Answers. About the case. About her sister. About how she should answer Cedric's question. Ember pictured these desires as pebbles dropped into a lake, as petals shaken from her palm to float on the wind. She sank deeper into her own self. In here, sinking didn't feel like drowning. It felt like being held. Sometimes in meditation, her magic empowered her to reach out to ghosts and spirits. Other times, it simply allowed her to sit with herself. That was all right. There was power in that, too. Ember's magic had a knowledge and an intuition that wasn't bound by petty earthly squabbles and lies. It burned like a clean white flame, and though it sometimes became clouded over in confusion, Ember felt comforted by the knowledge that somewhere, deep within her, she could always find it. When she finally opened her eyes, she stood from the bed. "Where are you going?" Kaylee asked her as Ember headed for the door. "I don't know," Ember said. "Suddenly I wanted to take a walk." Ember wound up at Matthew's house again. She wasn't sure why, but she was still in the drifting, comfortable state of mind her meditation always left her in, so she didn't question the impulse. Still, she had no interest in bothering George again. He wasn't too thrilled with her after their last conversation. She very much doubted whether the fact that she had worked to establish his innocence of his brother's murder would counterbalance the fact that she had ever suspected him to begin with. She didn't intend to pester him, so she didn't approach the door. Her magic didn't seem to want her to anyway. Instead, she took a long, slow look around. Matthew had a fancy house in a fancy neighborhood. He had built a beautiful life, the kind of life that could sustain his wildest desires and most indulgent hobbies and impulses. He hadn't expected death to come for him, that much was certain. But it had come for him. It had walked up this same walkway where Ember now stood. And now all Ember needed to do was what figure it had assumed. As she looked up the pathway, something caught her eye. The trash can was out at the curb. None of the other houses had their trash cans out. Ember didn't think the next morning was the scheduled garbage pickup. But then again, George was new to the neighborhood, probably just figuring those sorts of things out. The can looked overfull, like it held more than just 1 week's worth of garbage. The lid didn't quite fit onto it. Ember approached, curious. There was something glinting, right where the lid peeked up. The can she had seen under the bookshelf. Already she could smell it, a rancid, deathly smell. With a distinct jolt, Ember understood what the can was. Even so, she needed to see it, to be sure. She had pulled on a flannel shirt over her tee before leaving her apartment. This she removed, and she used it to pinch the corner of the can and remove it from the trash. It was an empty can of turpentine. The calm haze drifted away from her like blown smoke. She was suddenly clear-headed, and all too aware that she was standing alone in an unfamiliar neighborhood near twilight. She dug for her phone. Cedric picked up on the second ring. "What's up?" he asked. "You know, I was just thinking about you. Do you think maybe tonight we could—" "Cedric," she said, cutting him off. Something in her voice made him go quiet. "I know who the killer is." Cedric heard her out. To his credit, he remained calm, even when he heard her explain that she was holding the murder weapon in her hand while standing right outside the dead man's house. Only when she had gotten through the entirety of her theory did he cut in. "All right," he said. "I'll be right there." "You agree with me?" Ember asked. "I agree that the theory makes sense," he answered. "I just need to have a few records checked, and we'll get right back to you. But I'll have my deputies do it while I drive out your way. I don't like the thought of you out there alone." They hung up. Cedric probably expected Ember to wait quietly, but instead she dialed the museum's number. James answered. "I'm sorry. The museum is closed for the evening," he said. "If you'd like to call back during regular operational hours." "James, it's Ember McNair." She heard the man give a distinct sniff. "Yes? What do you want?" Since she didn't have much time to waste, Ember jumped right in with her questions about the painting. James seemed taken aback, then demanded to know how she had learned all of this. He stonewalled her until she promised to keep quiet about it. After that, he was more forthcoming. Everything Ember learned from James backed up her theory. When he had told her the entirety of it, she thanked him and hung up. She made a third call. "Hello?" The voice of a killer. Ember took a deep breath to steady herself before she asked, "Hi, it's Ember McNair. I was wondering if you would mind meeting me tonight, as soon as possible. I was thinking, the steps of the museum?" Chapter 28. Cedric swooped in a few minutes later, his cruiser pulling up in front of Matthew's house. George stepped out on the porch as Cedric was taking an evidence bag and helping insert the turpentine can into it, and another one for Ember's flannel shirt, which was evidence now. Luckily, George didn't ask what was going on. Cedric and Ember were able to climb into the cruiser and leave without being stopped or questioned. "So?" Ember asked. "What records did you check?" "Just some medical ones with the hospital and with Dr. Tanner's office," Cedric said. "You were right. Everything in there backs up your theory." Ember nodded grimly. There was, of course, the inevitable rush of feeling her suspicions vindicated, but in this instance she wasn't actually too happy to discover the truth. When they were still 2 blocks away from the museum, Ember asked Cedric to pull over and park. "What?" Cedric asked. Then, with an unamused look, he said, "I'm not going to let you walk up there alone to confront a murderer." "I really don't believe I'm in any danger," Ember insisted. "But I do think it'll be tough to get the full story if the sheriff is standing right there." Then, when Cedric still didn't appear convinced, she said, "All right, I think I have a plan that should keep you happy." So Cedric remained in the cruiser under strict orders not to make an appearance until the time was right. Ember marveled at his willingness to follow her plan. In the early days, he never would have gone along with a scheme like this. He must really have a lot of faith in her. Meanwhile, Ember walked right up the front path leading to the museum door. The museum itself was darkened and locked up for the night. Ember doubted whether even James was still lingering around. There was only one man visible, sitting on the front steps leading to the museum door. "Good evening, Lorne," Ember said faintly as she walked up to him. He made a motion as if to stand, but she waved him off. Instead, she lowered herself onto the step next to him. Together, they looked out at the dreamy orange layer of sky hovering above the horizon, where the sun had just disappeared, the row of cozy little houses stamping out black silhouettes against the color show. "Thanks for coming," Ember said eventually. He looked at her sideways. "You find out anything else about Dr. Tanner's murder?" he asked, a curious tinge in his voice, like he was hoping she didn't know yet. "I have," she said. "You know, it's becoming pretty clear to me that Matthew stole the painting himself. Wouldn't you agree?" "I'm sure I don't know anything about it," Lorne demurred. Ember suppressed a rebuttal. Instead, she turned over her shoulder to glance back at the museum door. "All this time, I've known that Brent didn't seem like the sort of man to murder anyone. James might have done it, but he would hardly have endangered a museum piece by letting it get taken away. And George, the brother who stood to inherit, he was out of town. We seemed to be fresh out of easy suspects." Lorne huffed, obviously skeptical. "What are you saying? The painting did it?" "No," Ember said, patient and slow. "I'm saying that the murderer was probably someone who didn't intend to murder Matthew Tanner at all. Someone who only wanted to confront him about something. Something personal." "But everyone loved the doctor so much," Lorne remarked. And there it was, under his words, a vein of bitterness as rancid as turpentine. "This person went to Matthew's house. You know, that's the kind of house that could make someone who's already mad at the doctor even madder. So big, stylish, comfortable. If you hated the man, it might fan that hatred into a real flame." Lorne wasn't watching her. His gaze had fallen to the pavement, but she could tell her was raptly listening. "I doubt talking to him was much better. That same smooth, erudite confidence that made him so popular, I bet it could also just about drive you crazy. If you thought he'd wronged you in some way, and here he was using that high-class, educated way of his to try to convince you that you were the wrong one." Lorne's eyes grew slitted, not in anger, but almost in relief, like a man falling asleep. Almost imperceptibly, so faintly Ember doubted at first what she was seeing, his head began to nod. "And the can was right there. Turpentine, but you weren't thinking about that. Just a weapon of convenience. Nothing planned. For a strong man, a man who works with his hands, not like a surgeon, but like a construction worker does, strength not precision, it would have been all too easy to hit him hard. Too hard." Lorne didn't speak. Even up until that moment, Ember worried she might have gotten it wrong somehow. But his silence was confirmation enough. "It must be hard losing a wife so unexpectedly," she said gently, setting a hand on his arm. "I understand wanting to blame someone, and for the blame to become something else, something violent. Grief can make us into people we never thought we'd become." Now, tears were falling down Lorne's face. Finally, he spoke. "She died during surgery." His voice was cracked and sounded old, much older than Lorne was. "He's supposed to be this world-famous surgeon, and she just dies on the table?" He refused to take responsibility for it. Said there were proper channels if I wanted to file a complaint to sue, but I didn't want money. As far as I was concerned, he'd murdered her. "And that night?" Ember prompted. "The night Matthew died?" "I was furious," Lorne said. "When I went there, he said all right, said I didn't need to sue, he'd pay me out of his pocket, pay me off. What did I want?" Lorne laughed, hollow and broken. "What did I want? For my wife's life? Like there was a number that would undo what he had done to her." He shook his head, wiping his eyes on the back of his hand. "The next thing I knew, the can was in my hand, and he was—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. All of that could wait until he was charged and booked. "I'm sorry," Lorne said after a few racking sobs, "for attacking you. I knew you were getting closer and closer to the case, to the answer. especially after I let slip that I knew the doctor was killed with turpentine. I panicked. I don't think I'd have really hurt you. But this last bit was spoken with a great deal of doubt, and Ember knew that Lorne had been surprised to learn, that night with Dr. Tanner, exactly what he was capable of. Chapter 29. Cedric sat in his police cruiser a block away from the museum. There was a knock on his window. He looked up to see Officer Lewis, who had just arrived from the station to assist him with the arrest. "Get in, Lewis." Lewis was new to his station. He was 25 but had the angelic face of a 12-year-old. He was always eager to please. Cedric liked that about him. Lewis opened the door and eased himself into the passenger seat. "All right, sir? Are you recording a confession?" He looked down at the equipment sitting between them. "Yeah, Ember is about to try and get Lorne White to talk about the murder." "Cool. Is that the guy whose wife died on Dr. Tanner's table?" "Yes, I checked with the hospital, and by all accounts he was an excellent surgeon. He was a specialist, so there aren't many that can do his job." "Was there any neglect on his part?" "Nope. Lorne's wife's death was investigated by the hospital board, but everything was done by the book. It was just one of those tragedies that can happen during any routine surgery." "Poor guy. He must be devastated." "Yes, I'm sure he is. And the doctor he beat to death isn't too happy either." Cedric gave Lewis a sideways look. "Oh, yeah, sure." "Now shush. I think he's about to confess." Lewis leaned down and whispered, "Is Miss McNair all alone with him?" "Yes." "And what part of shush did you not understand?" Cedric whispered back. Lewis gave an apologetic grin and mouthed the word, "Sorry." They continued to listen as Ember coaxed Lorne into telling her what had happened between him and Matthew on the night of the murder. "Well, I think we just got our confession," Cedric said, looking down at his recording equipment. Lewis gave Cedric an enthusiastic nod accompanied by a childish grin. Cedric sighed. "You can talk now." "Cool," enthused Lewis. "What now?" "I don't know. Maybe, and I'm just spitballing here, maybe we should go and arrest him?" Lewis gave a determined nod of his head before exiting the car. When they arrived at the museum, Ember was sitting next to Lorne of the front steps. Cedric gave an internal sigh of relief seeing for himself that she was safe. He walked over to them and gave Ember an anxious look. "You okay?" he asked before looking down at Lorne and indicating for him to stand. Ember felt her heart flip at the concern in his eyes. She smiled a dreamy smile back at him before quickly checking herself. They were in the middle of a serious situation and she should conduct herself accordingly. "I'm fine." Lorne patted Ember's knee gently before being helped up by Cedric. "I assume you heard all that?" "We did," Cedric said, grabbing his cuffs from his side. Ember saw nothing in Lorne's eyes except a calm acquiescence. The love of his life was dead. The man he blamed was dead. And now his own life was over. He had the look of someone whose soul had been stolen, his skin pale, and his cheeks sunken. As Cedric turned him to put the cuffs on, he managed a smile of resignation, and Ember was sure she detected a glimmer of relief in his eyes. Ember inhaled deeply as a tear pricked her eye and threatened to spill onto her cheek. She sniffed and blew out slowly. Cedric and Lorne turned towards where the car was parked. They both took 2 steps before Lorne turned back to Ember. "There's something I meant to ask you," he said. "Why did the doc steal the painting in the first place?" Ember looked steadily into his eyes. It wasn't the black seas and dark skies he wanted. It was what was underneath it. Lorne looked puzzled and glanced up at Cedric, who was holding his right elbow. He turned back to Ember. "What do you mean? What could be hidden under a painting?" Ember raised her eyebrows and said, "Something much more valuable." Lorne's face pinched, but he shrugged and nodded before leading Cedric back in the direction of the car. Cedric handed Lorne off to Lewis and turned back to Ember, who was still sitting on the step. He mouthed his question. "Are you okay?" Ember nodded and held up her hand. Cedric made a phone gesture with his right hand and mouthed, "Call me later." Ember stayed on the steps of the museum for a while after the cruiser had pulled away, just thinking about Lorne. She thought about his wife, and about how different things would be if she hadn't died that day. Lorne wouldn't be overcome with grief, Matthew wouldn't be dead, and Lorne wouldn't be about to spend the rest of his life in prison. He could have been spending a lovely afternoon with his wife exploring the museum instead of being arrested outside of it. It was amazing how one event could set off a whole other sequence of events. Maybe someone else will die because Matthew was no longer there to save them. Ember's finger wriggled the end of her nose as she thought. Although she couldn't condone what Lorne had done, her heart ached for this poor man who was grieving over losing his partner. She was the person who made him whole, who made him a better man and with whom he shared all of life's events, good and bad. Maybe, Ember thought, having someone to share your life with is still worth the heartbreak, even when they're no longer there. Her mother liked to say, "It's better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all." Sure, she was talking about Ember's recently dead hamster, Chuckles, at the time, but the sentiment had stuck with her. Lorne had a lifetime of memories with his wife that he wouldn't have had if he hadn't married her. Ember looked at the darkening sky and beamed as a tear dropped from both eyes onto her cheek. She wiped her hand across her face. She knew what her answer was going to be to Cedric's proposal. Chapter 30. Did you hear? It was Sage, eagerly bursting into the broken broom in the middle of the busy lunch hour. Heads turned at her entrance, and Ember looked up from the latte she'd been in the middle of making. "Hear what?" Ember asked, pouring out the drink and setting it on Tara's tray. Tara was looking at Sage, though, like she was curious about Sage's news. Ember shook her head and shooed Tara away, and reluctantly the waitress went back to serving her tables. It wasn't like Ember wouldn't share whatever the news was later anyway. Sage leaned halfway over the bar in her enthusiasm. "I guess James Connor from the museum put out a newsletter to all the major museum donors. I heard about it from Miss Vickers out at the library. I guess she's a donor. Hey, do you think librarians actually make all that much money?" "Sage," Ember said, too excited for the news to wait any longer through this digression. "Out with it." "Oh, right," Sage beamed. "That painting, Black Seas. It turns out it's some kind of overpaint? Underpaint? What's the word for where there was a painting and someone painted on top of it, but the painting underneath is something valuable and important?" Ember was smiling gently to herself. "Oh?" she asked. "You don't say." But Sage caught her. She always did. Narrowing her eyes at Ember, Sage said, "You already knew. How did you already know?" "Just a guess," Ember admitted. "But James verified it for me the other day. I had to promise to keep quiet about it. So, what's the painting underneath?" "Didn't tell you that, did he?" Sage huffed, clearly disappointed that she hadn't been able to deliver the hot news she'd thought she had. "I guess it's some unknown piece by Reuben. Anyway, James's newsletter said that its value is like 10 times what Black Seas was worth." "Reuben," Ember said, musing. "That does sound interesting." It also sounded a lot closer to the kind of artwork Dr. Matthew Tanner had been interested in, according to George. "Do you have any insight into how James figured this out?" Sage asked. "I'm guessing the theft is part of the story." "Actually, yes," Ember said. "From what I can figure out, George discovered a can of turpentine and Matthew's notes about the painting at his brother's place. He realized what Matthew had been trying to do and did it himself. And then the museum, what? Just forgave the theft?" Ember shrugged. "I guess increasing the museum's asset in value 10 times over will kind of make them overlook a little thing like grand larceny. Though my guess is that if Matthew was still around, he'd owe Brent a pretty big payout for the injuries he caused during the act." "The museum is probably set for life on this," Sage remarked. "Not just the fact that they've got the painting itself, but the story of the discovery. That's the kind of story that sells. Later in the afternoon, Brent and Victoria came in and sat at the bar. They were both beaming. Brent was uncharacteristically dressed in a suit and tie, and Victoria was wearing a lovely light blue dress. "You don't keep any champagne here, do you?" Brent asked Ember, beaming at her. "Just the Prosecco we mix into Bellinis," Ember said apologetically. "That'll do," Victoria cried, clapping in excitement. Ember got to opening up a bottle. She couldn't help smiling looking at them. "Celebrating something?" "We sure are," Victoria cooed, looking up at Brent with wide, bright eyes. "We just came from City Hall." "We got remarried," Brent said, practically bursting at the seams in happiness. Ember poured out 2 glasses of Prosecco for them, and they toasted, then linked arms and drank. They seemed so giddy and in love that even as Ember tried to continue her work, she couldn't stop from glancing over at them again and again. She had come to a decision as to what her answer for Cedric would be. But in all the aftermath of the case, it had never seemed like quite the right time. Now it occurred to her that she had waited long enough. It might never be the perfect time. But it was certainly the wrong time to keep him hanging on, wondering. She would do it tonight. Cedric didn't get off his shift until late that evening. By the time he made it home, he was surprised to find Ember waiting outside, holding a doggy bag full of piping hot foot from the pub. "Hey," he said, smiling. "You haven't been waiting long, have you?" "No, not very." She hoisted the bag. "Cheeseburgers and waffle fries." "You are magic." He let her in, and they both moved easily and naturally into the house. He loved to see Ember in his space like this. There was something in his wolf instincts that just felt more settled when Ember was in his house. Ember set the food aside. Normally, she would have gone and gotten plates, but it looked like she had something else on her mind. Cedric watched her curiously, waiting for her to come out with it. "All right," she said finally. "I'm ready." "To eat?" Cedric asked. She shook her head. The expression she leveled at him now was striking, heady, full of weight. "To answer." After a second, Cedric understood what she meant. He nodded and swallowed, dry. "And?" She smiled. "And?" Grinning, she added playfully, "I can't answer if you don't ask." He was grinning now, too, and he rose and disappeared into his bedroom. When he emerged, he had the box in hand, and he was still smiling, shockingly handsome in his glowing excitement and joy. But when he dropped to his knee on the floor in front of her, the grin faded, and it felt as serious as the first time, a little thrum of energy like magic passing in the air between them. "Ember McNair," he said, and the air smelled of cheeseburgers, and Ember was wearing her apron from work, and Cedric was still in his uniform, and the moment was perfect, just perfect, for the part that came next. "Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, not a breath of hesitation. He rose and picked her up into his arms. When their lips touched, Ember's magic gave off a little spark, like a pulse of light in the air, a new light just for him that she knew would burn inside her forever.